Chapter 434. Andesha's expression changed when her thoughts were exposed. However, this was nothing compared to the pain and anger of losing the blood of the Dark God. "Stay here and obey my orders, and I'll let you live," Andesha said in a low voice. Brando did not find her bossy attitude funny. Instead, he raised his guard. He frowned and stood in front of her with his sword. Even though he had obtained the blood of the god of darkness and Odin's inheritance, and was close to reaching the elemental realm, Brendel knew that his strength was not enough to fight against the tree shepherds. "You're forcing me to side with Veronica. Andesha, I have no intention of fighting with you. As for the grudge between you and the Cruz Empire, I have no intention of interfering." He placed a hand on the unconscious red-haired girl's shoulder and said, "I'll leave with her, and you can continue to pursue the Lionheart sword. Maybe Lady Veronica will change her mind and agree to your request." Brendel. Veronica's emerald eyebrows furrowed. However, Brando ignored her. If it was before, he might have helped Veronica because of the Valkyrie, but after the previous battle, he had enough of these arrogant Cruz people. "You want to run? You must be dreaming." Andesha interrupted them coldly. "I won't let my personal belongings escape from my hands. Do you think I'm afraid of you joining hands?" Her purple eyes instantly became as long and narrow as a reptile's, emitting a cold light. "Whether it's the Lionheart sword or you, you're all mine." She raised her chin proudly. "If you want to struggle, you can try." Veronica immediately snorted. As the commander of the Azure Skies, she had never been looked down upon like this before. Even though she knew that the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders were much stronger than her, she still could not stand it. The moment Andesha finished speaking, the female sword saint had already made her move. She sheathed her sword and placed her left hand on her chest. She chanted an incantation to activate her first element source and swung the azure firmament forward. Veronica was truly going all out this time. Her jade-like eyes were locked onto Andesha's movements, and her brows were raised like a pair of sharp swords. Even her fair face was dyed with a layer of faint red. A green winged wyvern flew out from her sword. The wyvern spread its wings and let out a long dragon roar. Then, it circled in the air and pounced on the withering leaf overlord. At the same time, Brando was also prepared for battle. Andesha's words clearly indicated that she wanted to keep both of them here. It sounded a little arrogant, but she had the qualifications to do so. The 12 patriarchs of the tree herders were invincible in the early stages of the Amber Sword, with the exception of the ancient dragons and the old monsters among the Magi. When he saw Veronica's secret art of the sky, the Fairy of Wind, a circle of blackwood fragments appeared around Andesha's body. These fragments floated in the air, as though they were constantly turning into fine powder that was blown away by the wind. He knew that Veronica was serious about this. The decaying phenomenon was a sign that Andesha's element source had been activated. It was the first sign of the Withering Leaf Overlord's element source, decay. At this time, Veronica's actions angered Brando. Andesha's true strength was at least a level higher than this female commander. Compared to him, her strength was indescribable. Even if the two of them worked together, they might not be able to defeat her. Under such circumstances, a direct confrontation was the worst choice. And yet, this female sword saint did it. He raised Halran Gaia, and flames rose from the crimson blessing, wrapping around the blade in an instant. At the same time, he cursed Veronica's decades of experience on the battlefield had been eroded by her pampered life. But in other words, it was as if Veronica herself was a soldier, and there were not many fancy tricks in a battle. At this moment, Andesha was blocking Veronica's secret art of the Azure Skies with one hand while the unconscious Vahina was on the other side. This scene made Brando's eyes light up, and he suddenly thought of a strategy. Without hesitation, he drew a cross in front of his chest with his left hand, leaving a series of black afterimages behind him. Whoosh! A pair of wings made of black smoke spread out from his back, as if the Grim Reaper had opened his cloak. Brando activated his Berserk innate skill. His entire aura changed in an instant. Even though his temporary attributes could not break through the element wall, but after his strength and vitality exceeded 600, Brando could not help but feel the faintly discernible element wall. He stretched his hand forward, and the space in front of him shattered like layers of glass. A ray of black light shot towards Andesha from his 5 fingers, and she immediately felt the threat behind her. She was surprised and waved her hand behind her back. With a loud bang, the ground shook, and the incomplete earth golem blocked Brando's path. The ray of black light hit the earth golem's right leg, and a 2-meter-wide hole was blasted open, completely penetrating the earth golem's body. Brendel was startled by the penetrating power. The White Raven swordsmanship is affected by the power of darkness under Berserk innate skill. He was shocked, but he immediately felt a shadow rushing towards him. Brendel looked up and saw that the earth golem was falling towards him. Because its right leg was injured, it actually broke the stone pillar and lost its balance and fell towards Brendel's direction. Brando did not dare to be careless. He stomped on the ground and activated his charge skill. His entire body turned into a black line that bypassed the earth golem and shot towards Faina, who was beside Andesha. The explosion and smoke from the earth golem's fall completely obstructed Brando's plan. Andesha did not expect Brando's speed to be so ridiculously fast. Under the effects of Berserk innate skill and charge, Brando's speed was even faster than Veronica's wind element. Andesha did not even realize that Brando had closed in on her. You! Andesha noticed Brando in the smoke a little too late. She suddenly realized something and clawed at him with a sinister expression. The corrosive power brushed past Brando's body, and one of his sleeves and inner armor turned into ashes. But at least he was able to avoid Andesha's attack. Brando made use of this opportunity to leap forward and cut off Andesha's vines with his sword. He then reached out with his left hand to catch Faina, who was falling. The young girl snorted and furrowed her brows. Brando saw a red circle around her neck and knew that she had suffered a lot. But now was not the time to think about that. Andesha had already noticed his actions. Andesha shrieked in the smoke. She chanted loudly and stretched out her 5 fingers. A huge wooden spike suddenly appeared out of nowhere and pierced towards Brando. Brando cut off Andesha's vines with one hand and hugged Faina with the other. He was completely defenseless. The wooden spike pierced through the air, and he could only turn his head and focus his mind to form a solid barrier in front of him. When the wooden spike broke through the fog and suddenly pierced out, it just happened to hit the barrier. The huge force immediately twisted the wooden spike out of shape, and with a bang, it exploded into countless pieces. But this was not the end of the spell. The fragments turned into countless wooden claws and attacked Brando once more. Brando could only disperse the barrier and let the claws hit the transparent barrier. The wooden claws were once again affected by the magic resistance, and this time they turned into black dust that filled the air. All of this happened in an instant. Brando shook his head and felt a little dizzy. A strong will could provide him with a terrifying magic resistance, but it was not without cost. Just as the black dust was about to envelop him, he suddenly had an idea. Halrain Gaia wrapped in flames around his body, and the dancing flames instantly burned the dust to ashes. Thorn of the Living Tree was a spell that pierced through the target, followed by binding, and lastly, the powder was laced with poison. Anyone who was not familiar with this spell would be at a great disadvantage, but Brando had already expected this spell. After dealing with the 3 steps of this spell, he immediately leaped back with Faina in his arms and left Andesha's range of attack. Target achieved. Brando dodged 2 vine whips and shouted, "Veronica, Miss Faina has been saved. Let's split up and leave." He knew that the 2 of them together were not a match for the Lord of Withering Flowers. Veronica and Andesha were not fools if he wanted to escape alone with Scarlet. Veronica would only wholeheartedly cover his retreat if he saved Faina. As long as Veronica was willing to delay Andesha, the chances of him escaping would greatly increase. But when he shouted, Andesha was completely enraged. Andesha arrogantly treated him and Scarlet as her personal possessions, especially the precious blood of the Dark God in Brando's body. She would not allow him to escape so easily. The Lord of Withering Tree Herders let out a high-pitched shriek. She opened her hands, and countless thorny vines surged out from the ground and blocked Brando's path. Shit! Brando's heart skipped a beat when he saw the huge cage that was formed out of thin air. He immediately realized that he had underestimated the Vine Lady's persistence. At this critical moment, a green light suddenly pierced through the fog. Wherever it passed, the vines would be cut in half. However, the green sword light turned into a flock of green birds and flew in all directions. Immediately, a large hole was blasted in the vines that had surrounded them in midair. Brando's eyes lit up and he immediately jumped out of the hole. He dragged Faina along and turned around. He saw Veronica standing behind him with her sword in her hand. The sword saint's long hair fluttered in the wind, and he could only see her back. The red-haired girl is over there. Bring her and Faina away first, Veronica said without turning back. Leave this to me. Thank goodness I'm not wrong. Brando sighed in relief. He knew that Veronica was not Andesha's opponent, but it was her choice to make this decision. Moreover, they were enemies before this, and Veronica had repaid him for saving Vahina's life. After all, this was just a business deal. Thus, he did not feel too burdened and immediately flew towards the white sacred stone. Andesha's angry roar could be heard from behind. Damned brat, don't let me catch you. However, her voice sounded flustered and exasperated. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 435. Brando thought that as long as Veronica stopped Andesha, he and Scarlet would have a chance to escape. But he realized that he had underestimated the situation. After half an hour of walking around the valley with the unconscious Scarlet and Vahina, a sharp whistling sound came from the sky. Brando turned around and saw a flash of green light in the night sky. Then, with a loud rumble, a figure fell in front of him and crashed into the ground, kicking up a cloud of dust. Brando saw clearly that it was Veronica. He was shocked and stepped forward. He parted the dust and saw the crew's goddess of war lying in a large crater, her body covered in blood. Veronica's battle robe was completely unrecognizable. Her inner armor was exposed in many places, and the friction between the armor and the ground caused white smoke to rise from the heat. Brando thought that Veronica had fainted, but when he took a step closer, she groaned softly and opened her emerald eyes. Quickly leave this place, cough. Andesha has caught up. Veronica's eyelids drooped, but her eyes were still filled with determination. Her body was riddled with wounds, and she could not move at all. She struggled to grab her sword, but Brendel was one step ahead of her and grabbed the blue firmament. Veronica was startled and looked at the youth in shock. Brando was also troubled. If Veronica still had the strength to fight, he would not have interfered. But Veronica was obviously going to die, and he would never watch her do that, even if Veronica had been unfriendly to him in the past. Brando knew that it was because of Vahina and the others. For Freya's sake, he thought and sighed, you are no longer fit to fight, Lady Veronica. Veronica looked at the two girls that Brando was supporting on both sides. She sighed in relief when she saw that Brando did not leave Vahina behind. But she stretched out her hand to Brando. Give me the sword. I'm sorry, but that's impossible. Miss Veronica, you have to come with me now. You know that's the Wither Overlord. If we run together, you won't be able to escape. Veronica closed her eyes and frowned. I wouldn't say that if I couldn't escape, Brando replied. Miss Veronica, I like miracles, but I never count on them. I like to gamble, but I won't put all my eggs in one basket. Veronica opened her eyes and looked at him with her deep emerald eyes. There was a deep color in her eyes. How are you going to take me away? I look like this. She looked at the two girls on either side of Brando and shook her head with a weak smile. Don't try to be brave, good child. Give me the sword, Brando smiled confidently. He raised his head and looked at the sky. When he lowered his head, he stretched out 2 fingers and black smoke formed a card at his fingertips. Brando raised the card and flicked it forward. Veronica was shocked to see a black hexagram appear on the ground out of thin air. After the light faded, a girl with long hair and short hair wearing a black tuxedo walked out from the black smoke. The girl came to Brando and put her hand, a woman's hand, in front of her chest and bowed respectfully. In the name of the venerated darkness, this humble one is Mephistopheles. I'm here to serve my master and await your orders. He paused for a moment and added solemnly, also, this humble one is male. His voice was soft and slightly neutral. Brando looked at Veronica with a strange expression and thought to himself, damn, he's a real trap this time. But now was not the time to care about that. He immediately pointed at her. Mephistopheles, help this lady up and follow me. Mephistopheles nodded respectfully and came to Veronica's side. He easily helped the fully armored female general up. Even though the vampire looked weak, he was still a gold-ranked warrior. It was not difficult for him to carry another person. Veronica was a little uncomfortable. She raised her eyebrows and looked at Brando, blood descendant of the blood throne, high dark magic, necromancer. Not high dark magic. It's just a family heirloom. Veronica pondered for a moment, a summoned statue. Brando nodded. The goddess of war of the Cruz Empire immediately shut her mouth. If he was a necromancer, he might be able to fight against Endesha, but a summoned statue was meaningless. A gold-ranked warrior was nothing in front of that woman. Veronica was silent for a moment before she spoke weakly, Endesha is behind us. I managed to shake her off at the cost of my injuries, but she will catch up soon. What do you plan to do? Brando thought for a moment and replied, there's a way. Lady Veronica, do you know what's in front of us? I don't know. Veronica frowned and looked at Brando suspiciously, you know. I know a little. Brando replied. There's a huge canyon in front of us, and it's also the center of the storm. Lady Veronica, I'm sure you haven't seen the scene of traveling through the clouds. He raised his head and answered as if he had seen it with his own eyes, and under the clouds, the winds will flow along the canyon. The most important thing is that the terrain is complicated. I can make it difficult for Endesha to catch up. But you won't be able to shake her off. I can't shake her off, Brando replied, but I can think of a way to get rid of her. Veronica raised her head and looked at Brendel with an expression that said, I want to see if this young man is indulging in his fantasy. The goddess of war of the Cruz Empire sighed softly. You've thought of a way. I've always had one. Brando flipped his hand over, revealing the gray gem that shone brightly in his palm. But it's dangerous. It was no longer practical to turn back, and the only way was to lure Endesha into the center of the loop of trade winds. Brendel had already thought about it from the start, and the plan in his mind was extremely bold. If Endesha pursued him relentlessly, then he would be luring her into the Hydra's lair. Provoking a battle between two bosses was something that the players loved to do in the Amber Sword. But the higher the level of the bosses, the harder it was to succeed. This was the difference between bosses and low-level bosses, especially Endesha and the Hydra. They were even smarter than most humans. It was not easy to make them fight. But Brando knew that it was not impossible. He remembered that when he inherited the fate of the fool, the great gem had resonated with a certain existence in the center of the loop of trade winds. As the inheritor of the great gem, Brando could vaguely sense a familiar aura. It was the aura of the Hydra from before. Even though the Dragon of Darkness did not tell him about the relationship between the great gem and the Hydra, Brando was not stupid. He could imagine that the great gem was obtained by a monk from the Holy Cathedral of Fire through some unknown means, which led to the pursuit of the Hydra. With this explanation, it made sense why Amon acted so strangely. It also made sense why the Hydra would let him go and attack Amon instead. Brando had reason to believe that the other end of the resonance with the great gem was the Hydra's lair. Of course, he did not dare to say that he was 100% sure. But the current situation did not allow him to think about it, and he could only take a gamble. Brando kept the great gem and continued forward with the Mephistopheles. Just as Veronica expected, Andesha quickly caught up to them through the traces they left behind in the canyon. According to Brando, she was as sharp as an experienced hound when it came to tracking. But considering that the tree shepherds were half a druid, it was understandable. The relationship between the tree shepherds and the ring of sky was like the two sides of light and darkness. Brando and the rest could not help but slow down as they trudged through the canyon. Andesha passed by them several times, but Brando was able to avoid her due to his familiarity with the terrain. She even suspected that this was not Brando's first time here. But no matter how she asked, Brando refused to speak. In the end, she gave up. After a few hours, Brendel's group was the first to enter the ancient isthmus. The ancient isthmus was the last pass to enter the ruins of Valhalla, and it was also the deepest part of the Wall of Clouds. The ancient isthmus was shrouded in clouds, and Brando and Veronica felt as if they had returned to the time when they encountered the Hydra. The only difference was that the terrain of the ancient isthmus was notoriously complex in the entire game. Winding valleys and intersecting canyons covered the entire area. There were no plants, and the ground was covered with volcanic rocks and obsidian. Large rocks formed all kinds of blind spots, and Brando could easily avoid Andesha in such an environment. But the thing that gave him a headache was that the woman seemed to have an intuition that kept her close to them. There were a few times when she almost discovered them. A game of cat and mouse was not fun for the prey, especially when it was a matter of life and death. After advancing for half a day, Brando stopped to rest for the first time. Because they had lost their backpacks, they did not bring any food. Veronica would not bring any food, and the cruise people's rations were left behind. Moreover, the Sword Saint probably did not expect this situation to happen. Brando could only endure the feeling of emptiness in his stomach. Fortunately, after absorbing the blood of divinity, the hunger was not as strong as before. He sat quietly against a large rock. Even though his body was cold, he did not dare to light a fire. Everyone knew that Andesha was still nearby. Veronica was placed down by the Mephistopheles and sat opposite him. The cruise goddess of war was tired from losing too much blood, but she looked at Brando with her emerald green eyes. "You know, little one, because you are Erwin's subordinate, I will not thank you." Brando was startled. "I don't need that either." He pursed his lips and said in a nonchalant tone. "Do you want to learn swordsmanship from me, Brando?" The woman closed her eyes and smiled gently. "My swordsmanship, Sky Wall, huh?" Brando looked at Veronica in confusion. He almost thought that he had misheard and wanted to dig his ears with his hands. "You don't want to?" "No." Brando was a little stunned. How is this possible? After all, he was not even a cruise's subordinate. I can't become a cruise's subordinate. I said, but this time, Veronica shook her head gently and interrupted him. The woman sighed and seemed to want to say something, but Brando did not hear anything else after that. The young man waited for a long time. He looked at the Sword Saint and found that she had fallen asleep due to exhaustion. Her head was lowered, and her breathing was long and even. What the F***ck? What the F***ck? Brando suddenly screamed in his heart, "Big sister, can't you at least say it all at once? There's still suspense. Don't be like this." But just as Brando was lamenting over the loss of Sky Wall, Mephistopheles, the only one who was still awake, looked at his master and said, "Dear master, I'm hungry." Brando was stunned. He looked at the vampire lady who looked like a girl but was actually dressed like a male aristocrat. He thought for a moment and then replied, "Well, sorry, there's no more food." Unfortunately, Mephistopheles just tilted his head and looked at him with his blood-like crystal eyes. It was as if he was a delicious meal. But wait. Brando's face suddenly turned a little ugly. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.cheedian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 436. The wind was as sharp as a knife as it cut through the cliffs. As they went deeper into the ancient isthmus, the wind that blew through the valley became stronger and stronger. The strange thing was that the wind did not blow away the clouds and mist. Instead, the white mist often appeared together with the fierce wind. It swallowed the clouds and spat out fog, causing sand and stones to fly everywhere. It made the visibility in the valley extremely low. This situation allowed Brando and the others to avoid Endesh's pursuit, but it also made the trek through the valley even more difficult. Brando placed his hand on a protruding rock. The wind blew so hard that he had to squint his eyes. He turned around and passed his hand to Scarlet, who was climbing up. He placed Scarlet on the platform, followed by Vahina. On the other side, Veronica climbed up with the help of the Mephistopheles. In the end, Brando also climbed up against the wind. "That's the legendary Tempest Circle in front of us, right? Legend has it that no one has ever been able to cross that wall made of violent winds," Veronica said as she held her azure firmament in one hand. She turned around and looked at Brando with her emerald eyes. "What do you plan to do, little one?" Even though the crew's goddess of war was still weak, she seemed to be in good spirits. Brando climbed up the platform. The valley was split into two, and on the other side was a bottomless ravine. The black granite was split in the middle, and the fracture was smooth and flat, as if there was a huge fissure in the ground. The wind continued to flow in the direction of the fissure, and the airflow formed a white line that looked like a sea current that was suspended in the air. The nest of the Saint Hydra was right below. Brando was speechless for a moment before he turned around and answered, "The way to pass through the Tempest Wall is through the underground. The Druids have invested a lot of manpower and resources into this place for the past 100 years just to find that passage. They found it." Brando shook his head. "So you know?" Veronica asked as she looked at him. "I've read about it in an ancient document. It should be nearby. Ancient texts are used to being ridiculed, and I have a tendency to turn this excuse into a hidden truth. The entrance to the underground passage is at the bottom of this bottomless chasm, but going down is not an easy task." At this time, Brando noticed that Scarlet was looking at her wrist with a strange expression. He immediately felt awkward and couldn't help but touch the teeth marks on his wrist. However, he really didn't know how to explain it. Perhaps it wasn't some kind of hand-kissing gift. But damn it, it turns out that life points can't be withdrawn automatically. Scarlet woke up at the right time. Brando had a headache, but he turned back to look at Mephistopheles. That damn transvestite turned his face to one side. Well, to go down from here," Brando awkwardly changed the topic. "It looks a little difficult. I'm not sure if there's a way down. Go down from here." This was the first time the noble daughter of the crew's family spoke since she woke up. She seemed to have woken up from her depression. She frowned and raised her eyebrows. Vahina looked down at the pitch-black chasm with a pale face. "That's too whimsical, isn't it? For a spoiled, weak, and incompetent young lady, that's indeed the case." Mephistopheles replied quickly. He looked expressionlessly at Vahina, who was staring at him in disbelief. "That's why I said, please don't question the master's decision, you." "Enough, Vahina." Veronica interrupted them. "Since the ancient document mentioned that passage, there might be a way down. Let's look for it." "I'm sorry, but there's no such ancient document." Brando cursed inwardly. However, he did think of a possibility. Back when that player entered the loop of trade winds, his strength wasn't even half of his. Since that player couldn't climb down this cliff, it meant that there was indeed a path leading to this cliff. But before that, Brando drew a card from the Planeswalker system's deck. It was the Holy Sword. He frowned. He had hoped that it would be the Silver Stallion. That way, he could send everyone down the chasm after 3 trips. But things did not go as he wished. Ever since he left the Holy White Stone, it had already been 3 stages. But he only drew the Pristine Archangel, the Golden War Flag, and the Holy Sword card. In addition to his original hand, there were the Blood Throne Vampire, Wind Spirit Spider, Holy Sword, Fire Djinn, Sprint Drive, Energy Drain, and Fire Claw Bugler. The Blood Throne Vampire and Wind Spirit Spider were still on the battlefield. The Holy Sword was originally used up, but it was now back in his hand. The Fire Djinn had entered the graveyard during the battle with Amon, and the Fire Claw Lord was still in the graveyard. Energy Drain was used up when he fought the Warg and was shuffled back into the deck. The Fire Claw Bugler and Pikeman should still be on the battlefield, but they should be with Amandina. Other than the Wind Spirit Spider, Brando did not have the time to reset any other cards. He had a few chances to do so, but he missed them because he was unconscious. "Andesha is down there," Scarlet suddenly whispered. Brendel was taken aback. He looked over and saw that the woman was indeed chasing after him along the valley. But it seemed that she had not discovered them yet. The wind in the chasm was strong, and they could only see a sky full of sand and clouds. But Andesha's speed still made him suck in a breath of cold air. She did not know the correct path, and she was only 1 step behind them. The difference in strength was a little too great. Brando quickly lowered his body and gestured to the others to lie flat on the boulder. He then turned back and whispered, "Regardless of whether there is a path or not, we have to go." That woman. Faina seemed to have recalled the previous incident and could not help but tremble. She clenched her fists so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Brando immediately gestured to Mephistopheles to pull the young lady back. At the same time, he brought Veronica and Scarlet back carefully. He gestured to the others, "We have to walk along the cliff and see if we can find the path." Veronica and Scarlet nodded. But no one expected that when Mephistopheles helped Faina up, she seemed to have lost her balance and slipped down. "Careful." Brando's expression changed as he shouted. Mephistopheles reacted quickly and grabbed Faina's ankle, hanging her upside down in the air. Even though the crossdresser's strength was so great that it almost caused tears to fall from the noble lady's eyes, at least he managed to catch her before she slid down. Vahina bit her lips hard to stop herself from screaming. She looked up with a pale face and saw a pebble rolling down in that direction, making a crashing sound. The few of them froze on the cliff. Brando looked at Andesha's direction with a grave expression. But fortunately, the wind in the chasm was strong, and Andesha did not seem to have noticed the commotion. "Save! Save me!" Faina was clearly frightened. Her leg was lifted upside down by Mephistopheles, and her whole body swayed back and forth on the cliff. Even a man would not be able to endure such a situation, let alone Faina, who had never experienced such a situation before. She looked as if she was about to cry at any moment. Brando could not help but glance at her. He could not understand why the goddess of war, who was known for her calmness and foresight, would bring along a useless noble with her. This was a rather euphemistic way of putting it. In fact, Faina's influence on Veronica was negative no matter how he looked at it. Veronica sighed. What could she say? This was not her idea, and Elman was the one who made the decision. Moreover, Elman and Faina were both descendants of large families and not her direct subordinates, so she could not say anything. Brando could tell from her expression that the Empire was not as united as before. Otherwise, they would not have sent a group of people to deal with such an important matter. But this was still considered good, at least compared to Aween. He nodded at Mephistopheles and motioned for them to pull Faina up. Although he wanted to throw her down, he was afraid that Veronica would immediately draw her sword against him. Mephistopheles obeyed and slowly pulled Faina up. But at this moment, before the people on the cliff could even breathe a sigh of relief, something happened. Brando was stunned as he watched the dagger on Faina's waist slip out of its sheath. The dagger slowly fell. At that moment, it was as if time was stretched. Everyone saw the sword slowly fall, then hit a protruding rock, bounced to the side, and continued to fall, after which it was hit many times. Finally, a series of crisp metallic clangs could be heard from the bottom of the cliff. The cliff was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. Andesha stopped in her tracks. Then, she suddenly raised her head. Although she did not see the people on the cliff, her purple eyebrows twitched. She seemed to have determined the direction of Brando's group. Countless vines surged out from Andesha's back and escorted her forward. She then turned into a dark green dragon and charged towards the direction of the cliff. The craggy terrain was not an obstacle for Andesha. She walked on the cliff as if it was flat ground and closed the distance between them in an instant. Run! Brando was the first to react. He knew that Andesha had already discovered them. If she could not even catch this movement, then she was not worthy of being one of the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders. Brando! Don't speak, he interrupted her. Follow the original plan and run south. Brando paused for a moment. Help me take care of Scarlet. Veronica frowned and looked at him. She suddenly realized that this young man might be separated from them. In fact, that was exactly what Brando was thinking. If Andesha caught up to them, he would have to think of a way to lure her away. The nest of the Lernaea Hydra should be nearby. Under such circumstances, bringing the others, especially the useless young lady, would only be a burden. He made up his mind in an instant, but Veronica had already started to pull Scarlet away. Mephistopheles also pulled Faina up. He did not wait for her to regain her balance and dragged her by the arm. Faina's hand was in so much pain that she teared up, but she knew that she was in trouble. She gritted her teeth and did not dare to make a sound as she staggered behind. Brando was the last to leave. He looked at Andesha from afar and saw that she was moving at an astonishing speed. The few of them ran along the cliff towards the south. On one side was the bottomless abyss, and on the other side was the Lord of Withering Weeds. The distance between them was getting closer and closer. If not for the strong winds above the canyon, Andesha would have chased after them without any hesitation. But the difference in speed was too great, and Brando knew that it would not end well if he continued chasing after her. He turned around and released the Eternal Orb and the Wind Spirit Spiders to form a wall between them and Andesha. The Wind Spirit Spiders lined up in midair and formed a wall that shone with a green radiance. Get out of my way. Andesha looked at the green wall. She saw that it was just some ordinary wind spirit spiders, but as the matriarch of the tree herders and the Lord of Withering Weeds in the amber sword, she naturally recognized these little creatures. She thought that Brando was trying to stall for time, and she roared and waved her hand nonchalantly. Countless vines shot towards the wall of wind spirit spiders like steel spears. Andesha did not use her full strength, but this mistake caused her to suffer a great loss. In the next moment, the green radiance on the wall suddenly changed and was replaced by gold. The wall of wind spirit spiders seemed to be dyed with a dazzling golden light. Then, a golden light flashed. Countless pillars of light shot out from the wall and pierced through Andesha's vines, hitting her body in an instant. The matriarch of the tree herders screamed in pain. Even though a silver-ranked attack was not enough to injure her, it was enough to make her flustered and battered. Brando used up all his Earth EP in an instant and ordered the Holy Sword Art to attack without holding back. The continuous barrage of light pillars infuriated Andesha, but it was a pity that it was not easy for her to regain the initiative in the midst of the barrage of attacks. When Andesha finally managed to break free from the pillars of light, she was furious to find that Brendel and the others had pulled away from her by quite a distance. The withered overlord of the tree shepherds let out a furious roar. He waved a vine in his hand and tore the wind spirit spider's formation to shreds in no time. Then, she continued to advance. At this time, Brando immediately sacrificed the remaining wind spirit spiders. Sacrifice non-black creatures to the card, Blood Throne Vampire. P.S. 4,000 words, test it out. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.cheatyin.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 437. Sacrifice a non-black creature, Blood Throne Vampire. Select Wind Spirit Spider. A line of green text appeared in his vision. Wind Spirit Spider is treated as a creature card. Do you wish to sacrifice it to vampire? 1 card. Brando was stunned, but he nodded and added 3 battle counters to the card. A black flame ignited on Mephistopheles' body, and a circle of runes appeared on his neck and hands. Mephistopheles. Mephistopheles understood and threw Vahina towards Brando. Amandina shrieked in fright, but before she could finish her long, sound, she had already fallen into Brendel's arms. Brendel caught the young lady in his arms and subconsciously carried her in a horizontal position. Vahina's face was drained of blood as she stared blankly at him. Her chest heaved up and down as if she did not notice it. Brando! Veronica suddenly shouted, "Look over there." Brendel was startled and subconsciously raised his head. Suddenly, he discovered that there was a path leading downwards on the cliff. There was no doubt that it was the path that originally existed in the game. "Let's go." He was relieved and shouted, all by some time. Andesha had already closed in on them, and Brando gave Mephistopheles a signal. Mephistopheles suddenly stopped and turned around to face Andesha. He spread out a pair of black wings in the air, and a blue flame of negative energy appeared in his hand as he thrust it towards Andesha. Andesha's expression was as cold as ice. "You're courting death." She raised her right hand, and the thorny vines drew a long whip in the air. But at that moment, the green text in Brando's vision changed. Frowny face Wind Spirit Spider has entered the graveyard. Mana burn activated. Please select a target. Is there even a need to ask? Brando immediately locked onto the woman, mistress of withering death, Andesha. Hundreds of wind spirit spiders dissipated in the air and turned into green light that entered Andesha's body. The mana burn effect was extremely unpleasant, and it was harmful to the body. Andesha groaned, and her movements slowed down. The whip drew a curved arc in the air, and even if he was slightly slower, the Mephistopheles would not be able to dodge it. But the time that Brando bought was not in vain. Mephistopheles had already pressed the blue flame on Andesha's shoulder. The huge force sent Morpheus flying like a cannonball, crashing into the rock stratum and sending rocks flying everywhere. But Andesha also let out a shriek. Soul flames were a type of negative energy to any living being, and it was extremely difficult to defend against such negative energy. Even someone as powerful as Andesha was no exception to this. Even though the Mephistopheles were not a threat to her, the feeling of being injured was not pleasant, especially for someone as strong as her. In fact, Andesha could not remember how long it had been since she was last injured. She did not even dream that the vampire's fighting style would be so ferocious. Mephistopheles were only at the pinnacle of gold rank after their upgrade, and she did not even put them in her eyes. But she did not expect to suffer such a great loss. She was furious. Brando had humiliated her time and time again, and it had completely ignited her anger. But when she was about to move past the Mephistopheles, she noticed that the vampire had silently crawled out of the crater in the ground. He was covered in wounds. His left arm was hanging by his side, and his right hand was pressing on the wound on his left shoulder. It was still bleeding, the blood of a dead creature. Even though the Mephistopheles looked like a weak girl standing in the wind, her eyes were filled with determination. It seemed like she had no intention of letting Andesha pass so easily. Andesha did not waste her breath and swept her whip again. Brendel's group was running further and further away, and she did not intend to play a game of hide-and-seek with them. But right before Andesha swung her whip, a hollow occult orb appeared on Brando's left shoulder. It was the Eternal Orb. The young suzerain focused his mind and drew out a white card, Pristine Archangel. Show me the card. Pay the Eternal Orb fee and let the derivative enter the field. He did not care about Vahina's wide blue eyes as she stared at his sweaty face. In the next moment, 2 white magic circles appeared in the air. 2 angels crossed their swords and flew out at the same time. Please choose the resurrection card. The green text on his retina changed again. Lord of Fireclaw, Fire Djinn. Behind the 2 angels, the Fireclaw lizard man Lord Ropar and the Fire Djinn stepped forward. He then waved his hand and grabbed the Fire Djinn card in his hand, and shouted, "Sacrifice a non-black creature, blood-throne vampire. Choose the Fire Djinn." The green text changed again. The Fire Djinn has entered the graveyard. Self-immolation effect has been triggered. Please choose the target. Choose the Lord of Withering, Andesha. Brando threw the card forward. The pitiful Fire Djinn had just been resurrected when it was thrown at Andesha and self-immolated. With a loud bang, a golden-red fireball exploded in the wind. Even though the explosion did not affect the Lord of Withering tree herders, the flames still blocked Andesha's vision for a moment. She roared angrily and pulled the flames away from the explosion. But before she could do that, she saw a white palm covered in black pattern stabbing towards her chest with icy blue flames. That's impossible. Andesha's eyes widened in shock. She did not believe that a mere gold rank could dodge her attack. While she was stunned, the claws of the Mephistopheles had already pierced her chest. Is he faster than before? Wait a minute. Andesha sucked in a breath of cold air. She felt that her defense had been broken. This was the power of soul essence, and there was only one kind of existence in Wone that could control the soul essence. The undead. Did he break through the elemental barrier in an instant? What kind of joke is this? Andesha groaned. Her chest was once again invaded by the soul flames, and it was extremely uncomfortable. Not to mention, this attack was infused with the power of elemental barrier. It could be said that this was the first time Andesha felt threatened since she fought with Brando. She had no choice but to retreat. Of course, this did not mean that the matriarch of tree herders had retreated. A person who had just entered the elemental barrier was not enough to make her retreat. She just needed to adjust her attack. The moment Andesha retreated, countless vines shot out from her back in an attempt to bind the Mephistopheles. Although the Mephistopheles had entered the threshold of the elemental barrier after 2 boosts, he was still a far cry from Andesha. He tried to retreat under the encirclement of the vines, but he was still 1 step too slow. He immediately felt his hand and right leg being bound. The sharp thorns pierced through his fair skin, and fresh blood flowed out. As the summoner, Brendel also sensed the predicament his summoned creature was in. He frowned slightly and immediately sacrificed the pristine archangel that was a derivative. 3 more battle counters appeared on the blood-throne vampire card, and the Mephistopheles' abilities were further strengthened. The trapped vampire's body was already covered in black flames, but he could not break free no matter how hard he struggled. Mephistopheles could only dodge Andesha's attacks clumsily. He was quickly hit several times, and even one of his wings was broken. Mephistopheles spat out mouthfuls of blood and retreated, but he was still stubborn and did not intend to let Andesha pass. His attitude clearly angered the mistress of withering tears. She could not help but scream as she attacked, "Get out of my way, you loser!" She pulled Mephistopheles and threw him into the abyss. At this time, Brando and the others were just approaching the mountain path. The young man had no choice but to sacrifice the Fireclaw trumpeter, but he did not expect that he would still lose. Mephistopheles only lasted for a few seconds before he was sent flying by a whip. Brando watched as the trapped vampire was thrown into the abyss like a kite with a broken string, and disappeared in an instant. Mephistopheles! He could not help but shout, but the abyss did not give him any response. The young man sucked in a breath of cold air. Andesha's strength was beyond his imagination. Even though he had fought the patriarch of the tree herders before, he did not think that she was this strong. Archangel, Ropar. Brando had no choice but to turn around and order his two remaining summons, "Stop her." In truth, he did not want to sacrifice the pristine Archangel because she was the only way he could retrieve the grave. But he could not care less at this time. If he was even a little slower, he might even lose his life here. But this time, his losses were great. There were at least 6 or 7 cards in the graveyard, and he would not be able to retrieve the grave for a period of time. This meant that the number of cards he could use would be greatly reduced. "Boy, are you a summoner?" Veronica had seen everything that Brendel had done, but it was only now that she had the chance to ask about it. Brando saw Ropar and the pristine Archangel blocking his path, but he did not answer and only nodded. Under such circumstances, there was really nothing to hide. He might as well wear this hat first. With a preconceived notion, at least Veronica wouldn't be able to guess his true identity. At this time, the group rushed down the mountain path. Brando looked around and made a decision. He turned around and saw Ropar and the pristine Archangel turn into white light and return to the graveyard after exchanging a single round of blows with Andesha. He could not help but narrow his eyes. He knew that Andesha had no qualms about going all out at this time. At this time, the patriarch of the tree herders was completely enraged. Brando knew that his chance had come. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 438. The mountain path that branched off was right in front of them. However, rather than calling it a mountain path, it was more like a series of protruding rocks from the cliff. It was hard to say whether this was a magnificent feat of man-made carving. It was just that it was a miracle for a man to complete such a project on a cliff like this, even if there were no strong winds. But now, it could only be described as a miracle. "Lady Veronica, give me the Lionheart sword. I'll go down, you guys run from the top." Brando shouted as he ran. His voice was muffled by the wind. The Lionheart sword. Veronica saw Brando's gaze on the azure firmament in her hand and suddenly understood. She looked at Brando in disbelief, but the latter nodded at her. Veronica placed a hand on her sword and hesitated. But in the end, she still tossed it out. Brando caught the sword in midair and sprinted towards the mountain path that led to the abyss. Andesha, who was far behind, was slightly stunned when she saw this scene. She was probably thinking about which path to pursue. But even if she had her doubts, she still cared about the Lionheart sword that Brando spoke of. Besides, she would never give up on the blood of the Dark God. "My lord." Veronica grabbed Scarlet. "Don't go. Let me go." Veronica looked at the red-haired girl with a long ponytail in surprise. Her eyes were as fierce as a wolf cub's, and she bared her sharp teeth as if she was about to bite Veronica at any moment. Veronica was startled, but she could not help but chuckle in such a tense situation. "Oh, I can see that you really like your lord." "Ah." Scarlet panicked and forgot to struggle. Brando was already far away, and it was too late for her to turn back and chase after him. Andesha passed by them not far away, but she did not forget to throw a vine whip at them. Veronica quickly pushed Scarlet to the side and rolled to the side to avoid the whip. She crawled up and saw that Andesha and Brando had already disappeared. When she looked down, all she could see was the rolling clouds. Brando only remembered that he was still carrying Vahina when he landed on a sharp rock. The girl seemed to have been scared out of her wits, her teeth chattering. "Why didn't you put me down just now?" The young lady's voice trembled in the wind. "Miss, do you want me to put you down now?" Brendel jumped forward and weaved his way between the sharp protrusions of the rocks. He still had time to reply to her. "No. Hey, I said, do you want it or not? Wait. When I get back, I'll ask my father to chop you into pieces." "Wow, I'm so scared. Why don't I just make you unable to go back?" You dare." Brando loosened his grip, scaring Faina into shrieking and hugging his neck. Brando felt the back of his hand become wet. It was tears. Only then did he realize that he had scared this rich young miss to tears. "Whoa, you bastard, what a sin." But Brando did not feel remorseful at all. Instead, he felt that he had vented his anger. This rich young miss had caused him a lot of trouble, and the most recent one was just a few minutes ago. He could not help but turn around to look at Andesha's position. She was moving faster and faster through the fog. She was using vines to replace her hands and feet to climb the cliff. Her speed was not slow at all, and she was about to break through the fog and arrive behind them. There was a distance of about 10 meters between them. Andesha's vine whip swept across the distance, and something flew towards him with a whooshed sound. Brendel was on high alert, and he leapt into the air before it could reach him. He let the vine whip hit the rock and cut off a piece of it like a sharp blade. But he was a little worried that Andesha had entered his attack range so quickly. The Lord of Withering Decay was much faster than him, and she would definitely catch up to him at this rate. He looked up and saw rows of sharp rocks protruding from the cliff. There was no place for him to use as a foothold. Vahina rubbed her reddened eyes and said angrily, "That's right. Hey, your scabbard hit me." Scabbard. Only then did Brando realize that he was still holding on to Veronica's azure firmament. His eyes lit up as he suddenly had a plan. "Good idea." What? "After your reminder, I thought of a good idea." "Good idea? What are you talking about?" Vahina was stunned, but she suddenly felt her body become light, as if she was riding on the clouds. She turned around uneasily, only to find that Brando had actually leaped into the abyss like a bird. The aristocrat's daughter opened her mouth wide. She couldn't even make a sound. She had never been so excited in her life, and her heart was about to jump out of her throat. Vahina felt a strong gust of wind blowing against her face. Tears flowed out of her eyes. No, they flew out of her eyes. She felt like she was about to die, about to die. In short, she was about to die in the next moment. But he was not looking for death. He suddenly pulled out his sword from its scabbard and stabbed it into the cliff. A sharp screeching sound rang out as azure firmament pierced through the cliff, leaving a trail of golden sparks in its wake. The two of them stopped falling and hovered in the air. They had already fallen a long distance and left Andesha far behind. Brando had already set his sights on a rocky platform not far away. He pulled out azure firmament from the cliff and landed steadily on the platform. Even though there was wind in the valley, it was not a big deal to an existence of his level. Then, he repeated this several times, and actually managed to steadily reach the area near the lowest level of the abyss. When he finally stopped, Vahina was half hugging him and looking at the sky. She was panting heavily, her chest heaving up and down as if her soul had not returned to her body for a long time. "Am I dead?" she asked in a daze. Brando thought for a while and suddenly let go of his hand. Vahina fell to the ground and cried out in pain. What are you doing? That's why you'll know when I let go of you. Whoa, you scoundrel, the young lady started to cry pitifully again. At this moment, the young lady no longer had her fiendish appearance. Brando felt numbness in his right arm. He raised his head and looked up. If possible, he did not want to go through this again. It was too exhilarating. Even with his physique and strength, he almost could not endure it. He lowered his head again. He could vaguely see a layer of black fog below. He and Endesha were very fast and had reached the bottom of the abyss in a short while. But it's hard to say where the Lernea Hydra is. We have to continue our pursuit. He crouched down and pushed Vahina's shoulder. Stay here and hide. I'll lure her away. Vahina was startled and even forgot to cry. Brendel saw with his own eyes that the girl's blue eyes suddenly became alert. He did not know what she was thinking, but she suddenly opened her mouth and said, "I'll go with you." Oh. Brando thought that she hated being with him even more so than Endesha. But he quickly shook his head. That won't do. You'll slow me down if I bring you along. Brendel was about to leave, but the moment he turned around, the noble lady quickly got up and followed behind him. Brando immediately sighed. It's dangerous to follow me. Don't you know what I'm going to do? It's even more dangerous to stay here. Why, you can't leave a noble lady behind, and in such a dangerous place. Her voice was getting softer as she spoke. Oh, Brando paused for a moment, but Vahina was right. Who knew what was at the bottom of the abyss? Even if they were hiding here, it was hard to say what would happen if they encountered any monsters. He did not mind, but Scarlet was still with Veronica. He thought for a moment and stretched out his hand. Come. What are you doing? Vahina immediately became alert. Didn't you want to go with me? But who wants to hold your hand? Then forget it. Brando pretended to leave. Wait. Hey. Vahina gritted her teeth and swung her twin ponytails as she hurriedly ran up to him. She looked at Brando's back and hesitated for a moment before grabbing his hand. She was a little afraid of the surroundings, but she still stubbornly said, "Why, you must remember that I'm not doing this because I'm afraid, and I won't thank you." Oh, Brando replied with a long drawl. Endesha had not caught up to them yet, and the two of them slowly walked to the bottom of the valley. There was a layer of gray mist here, and there seemed to be a smell in the air. Brendel sniffed the air, but before he could say anything, he heard Vahina's voice. Strange, there's a strong elemental aura in the air. It's a blunt elemental aura. Brando turned around. You know it too. Why can't I know it? Vahina rolled her eyes. I'm an elementalist, are you? What kind of elementalist are you? I'm a magic swordswoman, country bumpkin. Brendel used to be infuriated by her calling him a country bumpkin, but now it sounded different, especially when the lady's eyes were red and swollen like a rabbit's. He could not help but laugh. What are you looking at? Vahina glared at him, probably annoyed by his stare. You said this is a blunt air elemental. Do you know what a blunt air elemental is? All elemental is active, and only elemental that has been deposited in an area for a long time will become blunt air elemental. But it's really inconceivable. How can a place accumulate so much elemental energy? Do you feel that the elemental energy is getting denser? Brando asked. Yes. That means we found the right place. What? Vahina saw Brando take out a gray gem that shone with a faint luster. She was stunned for a moment, and felt that the gem was exceptionally beautiful. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 439. When Brando took out the gemstone, a ray of gray light shot out from it and pierced through the fog as if it was pointing in a certain direction. What is this? Faina asked. Why should I answer you? You cruise people don't care about Erwin's answer, do you? Brando raised the gemstone like a lighthouse in the fog. Faina was speechless. But Brando ignored her and continued forward, and Faina followed him without a word. The light from the gemstone was actually some kind of resonance, and the other end of the resonance was in the abyss. The two of them walked for a while in the fog. The scenery around them was constantly changing, and there seemed to be a layer of flowing water beneath their feet. The monotonous scenery made them sleepy, but after they advanced for a while, the gem in Brendel's hands suddenly dimmed. What's wrong? Faina asked curiously when she saw it. We're here. Brando kept the gemstone and leaned against a rock. Even though this was part of his plan, the Mistborn was not as easy to deal with as Endesha. Then, he carefully poked his head out from behind the rock and saw a huge crater behind the white fog. But when he looked down, he immediately held his breath. What kind of scene was that? There was a prehistoric beast lying in the crater. But it was not a hydra like Brando had imagined. It was a wolf, and its tail was as long as the canyon. The wolf was sleeping, and its body was as white as snow. Its silver hair shone in the darkness. But even if its body was curled into a ball, it was still more magnificent than the most majestic mountain in the canyon. Its huge and beautiful mouth was placed on its front paw. Its eyes were closed, and there was a silver scar on its eyelid and one side of its cheek. Brando looked at it and gulped. He almost forgot to breathe. At this time, Faina also poked her head out from behind him. Her eyes widened and she almost screamed, but she quickly covered her mouth with her hands. Well, what is this? Faina asked in disbelief. Brendel's eyes lit up as he looked at the giant wolf. He took a deep breath and said, Son of the 12 Moons, Warg Hattie. Ah! Vahina covered her mouth and cried out as well. The Alpha Wolfakis was the son of the 12 Moons, the source of the calamity of the wolves. The northern border of the Cruz Empire was constantly invaded by the calamity of the wolves, and Faina naturally knew about it. But the Alpha Wolfakis was the son of a demigod. Even though there were countless legends about it, no one believed that such a creature actually existed in the real world. How could this be? Why you're not mistaken, are you? Faina stammered. The giant white wolf is Hattie, not to mention that there is a wound on its right eye from the battle with the winter wolf. Brando suddenly paused. He suddenly thought that this thing could be one of the forms of the nightmare mist. After all, if it could turn into the Saint Hydra, why couldn't it turn into Akis? But at this time, he suddenly felt Faina poking his waist from behind. Brando, Faina looked up and sucked in a cold breath. She seemed to be tongue-tied. Brendel saw the young lady's expression as if she had seen a ghost, and he immediately became alert. He raised his head and suddenly saw an unbelievable scene. Above the Alpha Wolfakis, the majestic atmosphere slowly changed into various shapes. One moment, it was the Saint Hydra, the next, it was other mythical creatures. But the fog slowly gathered and finally turned into the image of the Saint Hydra with 15 heads. The phantom of the ancestral beast appeared in the sky. However, 15 pairs of blood-red eyes suddenly opened, exposing themselves to the murderous and malicious gazes. Brando and Faina felt a chill in their hearts, as if they were pierced by 15 sharp swords and nailed to the ground. At the same time, Brando suddenly thought of a possibility. He looked at the sleeping Akis and then at the huge phantom in the sky. If this was a dream of the alpha wolf Akis, then the ability to affect another world through a dream was a real nightmare mist. No wonder it was called a nightmare mist. So this thing was just a dream of Akis. How could a dream be so powerful? It saw us. Vahina stammered. Brando quickly pulled her back. Don't be silly. It hasn't seen us yet. It would have attacked us if it saw us. Be quiet, don't attract that thing here. He then looked at the 15 dragon heads above the abyss, knowing that the great gemstone in his hand had been sensed by the other party, which was why the misty nightmare reacted. But it was strange, how did the great gemstone have anything to do with Hattie? With that in mind, he withdrew his gaze from behind the boulder and pulled Vahina back as well. You want to lure that woman here? Faina crouched behind the rock and put her hand on her skirt. Although the edges of her skirt were torn beyond recognition, she lowered her head and thought for a moment. Brando was stunned. He looked at the blonde girl with twin ponytails in surprise. I didn't know you were smart. What are you talking about? Faina gritted her teeth and glared at Brando. Sho! Brando glared at her. Faina was shocked and quickly lowered her voice. How did you know there would be such a thing here? Is it related to the gem in your hand? Brando chuckled. You guessed right. Guess again. TCH, even an idiot can see through your plan. You think you're so smart. Brendel coughed and his face was a little hot, but he immediately retorted, Is that so? No wonder you saw through it. You. Faina raised her eyebrows. Her twin ponytails were about to explode. But when she saw Brando put a finger to his lips, she immediately deflated. Hateful Aween country bumpkin. She muttered under her breath. But Brando was not in the mood to bicker with her. He turned around and looked at the surrounding terrain. He chose a spot where the Lernea Hydra would not be able to spot him easily. He then gestured to Faina and led her there. It was a crack in the cliff. From there, one could clearly see the entire valley of the abyss. There was also a huge crater on the other side. He chose this spot to avoid the Lernea Hydra's gaze, and also to monitor Andesha's movements. He calculated that she would catch up to them in 10 minutes at most. As expected, the Lord of Withering Tears figure appeared in the fog. She had followed the tracks left behind by Brendel and Faina, but it was difficult for her. She could only rely on the remnants of their scent to track them down in the rocky wastelands. Andesha was still quite a distance away from the crater. She did not notice the Lernea Hydra's presence in the sky, and she happened to be in the Lernea Hydra's blind spot. Brando knew that he could not let her go any further. Otherwise, she would be alerted. He had to finish the deed before the woman realized what was going on. He took a deep breath. Hey, I'll talk. Bumpkin, will your plan work? Faina saw Andesha's appearance and her body tensed up. She swallowed her saliva and asked anxiously. Brendel glared at her, thinking that the courage and calmness that he had worked so hard to gather was completely defeated by this woman's words. But he did not have time to think. When he took out the grey gemstone, the Lernea Hydra's phantom slowly moved. It seemed to have sensed the presence of the grey gemstone, and its 15 heads surrounded it. It's here. Brando's heart skipped a beat. He raised the grey gemstone, and the Lernea Hydra's phantom in the sky moved. Their target was the cliff in this direction. Bumpkin, you. What are you doing? Faina looked at him and felt that something was wrong. Brando did not intend to answer her, and he did not have the time to do so. One of the Lernea Hydra's heads swooped down from the sky. Brando did not have the time to think. He immediately pushed Faina away and rolled to the side, causing the Lernaea Hydra's jaws to miss. He then grabbed Vahina's hand and started running. Behind him, the Hydra's four heads broke through the fog and caught up to them in an instant. One of the heads even brushed past their heads, causing Vahina to shriek and crouch down to cover her head. Brando had no choice but to turn around and support her back with one hand while the other wrapped around her legs. He then carried her and ran down the canyon. Fortunately, the Lernaea Hydra's multiple heads could not attack at the same time in this abyss. Otherwise, they would have surrounded Brando in an instant. But now, the 15 heads had to block each other, so they were slower than Brando by a beat. Furthermore, there were many cracks in the cliff, and the Lernaea Hydra could not do anything to him as he weaved through the cracks. Brando quickly slid down the cliff with Vahina in his arms. He turned a corner in the valley and immediately bumped into Andesha, who was walking out of the fog. Andesha was still holding onto Azure Firmament's scabbard, which had fallen into the valley when he was trying to draw his sword. Azure Firmament was a fantasy weapon, and its scabbard was made of special materials. Even though it fell from such a height, it did not break. But the tree herder's patriarch was stunned when she saw Brando carrying Vahina through the fog and landing in front of her. Her purple eyes stared at the youth in surprise. She was stunned for a moment before she teased him. "Why? Did you deliver yourself to me?" Brando shook his head. "It seems like you already know that the Lionheart is not with me." He took a deep breath and looked at the scabbard in Andesha's hand. Andesha snorted coldly, "It doesn't matter. The Angel of Darkness is more important to me." "Then what about this? What is it?" Andesha was stunned by Brando's words, but Brando had already thrown the gem to her. Andesha's first reaction was to whip it away, but when she saw the gem, her expression changed. "A seal shard." Andesha immediately used her vine whip to retrieve the gemstone. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 440. Andesha caught the gemstone with one hand, and a roar that shook the entire valley came from behind the fog. The fog suddenly split into two, and a large dragon head opened its mouth and pounced towards her without any warning. "Dragon!" Andesha was shocked, and she immediately chanted an incantation. "Northern Wind, I command you to show yourself to the world." She stretched out her hand, and a snowstorm appeared behind her. Sharp ice crystals shot forward like knives, and the snowstorm passed through Andesha's shoulders and body, but she was unharmed. Andesha's hair fluttered in the wind, but she did not move at all. Andesha was like a queen of ice. She remained motionless, but in an instant, a thick layer of ice covered the ground in front of her. Strong winds and snow covered almost half of the valley. Even the Saint Hydra had no choice but to retreat. The sharp ice crystals pierced through its body, riddling it with holes. Andesha sensed that there was something wrong with this dragon. She pointed at one of the heads and said, "Time will pass. Your scales will fall from your body, your muscles will rot, your blood will dry up, and your bones will rot. Your days are numbered, and you will rest in peace." The Saint Hydra suddenly roared, and the scales on its sacred white body began to fall off. Then, its flesh and blood fell like rain, turning into mist and fusing into the valley. Almost in an instant, the huge head completely vanished into thin air. But before Andesha could heave a sigh of relief, the air suddenly rippled, and the disintegrated head of the Lernaea Hydra reappeared. Andesha frowned. Brando and Vahina took the opportunity to sneak past the battlefield while Andesha and the Nightmare Fog were busy fighting. In truth, Brando had already activated charge when Andesha's attention was drawn to the Lernaea Hydra. But even so, he was still too slow, and the snowstorm landed on his shoulder. He could not feel anything on his right shoulder, and it was covered in a layer of white frost. He gritted his teeth and carried Vahina 100 meters away, and entered a crevice. Even though the battle outside was earth-shattering, it was still relatively quiet here. Brando stopped and sucked in a breath of cold air. His shoulder felt like it had been stabbed by a knife. It was said that when the pain reached a certain level, there was not much difference between burns, frostbite, and sword wounds. At least, that was what he thought. Vahina saw that Brando's face was contorted in pain, and could not help but ask with concern, "Hey, country bumpkin. What's wrong?" Brando gasped. Vahina wanted to care for Brando's shoulder, but she was annoyed when she saw his nonchalant attitude. She snorted and said stiffly, "It's nothing." But after a while, she whispered, "Hey, country bumpkin. What now?" "Miss, do you think I'm very free?" Brendel was out of breath. You're so petty. Are you saying that you're apologizing to me for your previous actions?" Vahina's sharp eyebrows shot up. "Of course not. Why would you think of that? Why would I apologize to a country bumpkin like you? Then what are you trying to say?" The noble lady blushed, which was a rare sight. She wanted to say, "Your shoulder is in so much pain, let me down and I'll walk on my own." However, her words changed into, "Hey, when are you going to put me down?" Her voice became softer and softer. "Ha!" It was only then that Brendel remembered that he was still hugging Faina. It was not his fault. Hugging Faina felt like handing over a package. If it was any other girl hugging him, he might have fantasized about it, but he really did not have a good impression of Faina. She was arrogant, conceited, evil, and clumsy. He couldn't help but glance at the noble's daughter and put her down. At this moment, the battle between the Saint Hydra and Endesha had reached its climax. The Misty Nightmare's 15 heads were constantly disintegrating and reassembling under Endesha's barrage of attacks, but the Misty Nightmare was forced to retreat without any room to retaliate. Brando was shocked when he saw this scene. Even though he knew that Endesha was powerful, he did not expect her to be this powerful. The Saint Hydra was a ferocious beast that had chased after Amon, Mephisto, Veronica, as well as the entire Holy Cathedral squad. Yet, it could only defend itself in the hands of one of the 12 patriarchs. However, the Saint Hydra's ability to reassemble itself was something that ignored Endesha's stamina. If Endesha could not find the key to solving this problem, she would be dragged to her death. Endesha's element was erosion, and she was not as fast as Veronica's wind. She could come and go as she pleased. But no matter what, Brando knew that it was best for them to leave. He wanted to return the way he came, but he suddenly thought that the entrance to the center of the loop of trade winds might be behind Ekka's lair. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was possible, and he decided to pass through from the other side. This way, they would have to pass right under the Saint Hydra's nose. It was dangerous, but Brando felt that it was worth it. The Saint Hydra and Endesha were locked in a fierce battle, and it would not notice them easily. Furthermore, the great gemstone was not in his hands. Yellow rays of light flashed above their heads from time to time. Those were the effects of Endesha's spells, and the Saint Hydra's roars echoed throughout the valley. It was as if the sky was about to collapse. The two of them carefully moved forward while holding on to the walls. Sand and gravel fell from the ground as the ground rumbled. Faina frowned, but she did not dare to complain. She only glanced at Brando from time to time. The two of them quickly walked out of the valley through the crisscrossing rock crevices. Although the sky and earth were changing colors in the valley, it did not affect the outside world. When they walked out of the crevice, the first thing they saw was the giant beast lying quietly in the center of the huge pit. "Wait, we're going to go through there." Faina suddenly noticed Brando's intentions. She pointed to the side of the Saint Hydra and asked with a pale expression. "Of course. Alpha Wolfakis. It's sleeping, what are you afraid of? What if it suddenly wakes up? Won't we be dead? Brando showed a look of disdain. That's the demigod's slumber, it won't wake up so easily. Are you still sleeping, Miss Faina? Faina gritted her teeth. She knew about the demigod's slumber. Gods would sleep for thousands of years, and they would not wake up no matter what happened. However, that was just a legend. Now that he was in the situation, it was completely different. The alpha wolf, Hattie, was the source of countless legendary wolf disasters. It was a white spirit, and it had an innate hatred for humans. In Cruz, every child grew up listening to the stories of white wolves that devoured humans under the moonlight. Faina was no exception. Now that she saw the source of the legend with her own eyes, she could not help but lose her ability to think. But Brando had already taken the lead. Even though she was afraid, she had no choice but to follow him. The two of them quickly reached the bottom of the pit. The explosions in the valley were still ongoing, which meant that the battle between Endesha and the Hydra was still ongoing. It was just that there was a thick layer of fog between them, and the sound was clearly very far away. Then, the two of them slowly passed by the side of that gigantic and graceful creature. They raised their heads and looked at this silver-white giant wolf's figure that was as graceful as a mountain range in the dark night. They couldn't help but feel a sense of insignificance and reverence. It was an instinctive reverence for power. The sleeping alpha wolf Akis was like a small mountain. Her breathing was long, and the silver hair on her back moved up and down. It was proof that a powerful soul was still pulsating in her body. But the wind around her seemed to have stopped, as if the center of the world was gathered there. So this is the alpha wolf Akis. Brando could not help but think. Even though he knew that he would not wake Akis up, he still subconsciously held his breath. Faina was the same. Her face was pale. Why won't he wake up even if we're so close? She stammered. Why would he wake up? Isn't the alpha wolf Akis the enemy of all intelligent beings? That's why he'll send out a pack of winter wolves to bite your neck. Brando gestured at Faina with his claws, causing her to shrink back in fear. What are you doing? I'm just telling you to cut the crap. Damn it, you country bumpkin. Faina grumbled unhappily. The two of them passed by the head wolf Hattie one after the other. When they passed by the head of the huge creature on its front paw, they both felt their hearts beating a little faster. But fortunately, Brando was not wrong. The demigod's slumber would not be awakened so easily. Faina even asked why they did not kill Hattie while it was asleep, but Brendel merely glanced at her and passed the azure firmament to her, telling her, "You're right, Hattie, you're right. I'll leave the responsibility of saving the world to you, young lady." Faina did not say anything after that, only staring at Brando with malicious intent. The reason was simple. She actually plucked up the courage to slash at one of the silver hairs of the alpha wolf, Hattie. As a result, the long sword was blocked by an invisible barrier before it could even get close to Hattie's body. Faina knew that it would be futile even if there were 100 of her. They then passed by the huge crater. On the other side of the crater, Brando quickly found a canyon made entirely of black granite. This was not surprising. What he was concerned about was, there was actually a huge stone door in the middle of the canyon. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 441. Brando and Vahina arrived at a dark canyon. A majestic stone gate stood in the middle of the canyon. There was a 100-meter-tall stone statue erected on both sides of the gate. It was the long-bearded king of winter, Keldon, and the axe-wielding Kurd. They belonged to Cruz's god of war. Both of them stood at the foot of the statues. They were not even as tall as the statue's big toes, and felt insignificant. Vahina looked up and saw a row of cuneiform words on the stone gate frowny face created by Darua for the final battle. "Oh, stars in the sky, may you still shine upon the land 1,000 years later." The words were written in an ancient language that was mostly lost after the War of the Holy Saints. Thousands of years had passed since the Azure Knight broke open the sky and brought his spear to the earth in the Second Era. However, when they saw this stone tablet today, they could vaguely feel the weight of the history that had been passed down in the same vein. The stars will still shine upon the land 1,000 years later. You may rest in peace, Brando said softly as he looked at the stone tablet. Vahina looked at him blankly and did not say a word. The silence in the canyon was a little mysterious. The first thing he confirmed was that this was the entrance to Valhalla. This ruin was once a fortress built to fight against the Twilight Dragon, and it was supposed to be the place of the final battle. But like most of the other Holy Lands, Valhalla was destroyed in that terrible war, and only bits and pieces of history and legends were left to trace its location. Next was to contact the Druids according to their agreement. Brando had to use the space gem given to him by the Druids to transfer Sifrid over. She was the key to opening the gate. He walked under the giant door and used his gloves to sweep away a layer of dust on the ground to reveal the rock underneath. Then, he took out Veronica's sword and drew a circle on the rock. He placed the 4 cyan gems on the circle's nodes. Next, he had to perfect the magic formation. Vahina found a rock and sat down. She could hear a deafening roar coming from the other side of the valley, and the entire valley seemed to be shaking slightly. She hugged her knees in fear. "Hey, what are you doing?" "Getting down to business. If Andesha doesn't come here, don't disturb me even if the sky falls down," Brendel replied. "That's right, I want you to keep a lookout for me." Vahina raised her eyebrows in surprise. This Erewhon country bumpkin actually dared to order her around. "You're not willing. Forget it then. Anyway, that woman is in a towering rage right now. She will definitely torture you before killing you." Brando carefully engraved the formation while describing it in a casual tone. "Oh, right. I heard that they like to cut off people's limbs and plant plants from hell on the cuts. Those plants are bloodthirsty. Have you seen them before?" The young lady was so scared that her face turned pale. She pointed at Brando while trembling. You, how could you say such terrible things? Am I not telling the truth?" Vahina's rose-like lips moved as if she was tongue-tied. It took a lot of effort for her to squeeze out a stubborn reply. "I am just returning a favor since you saved my life." She then looked at the other side of the canyon in a fit of pique. Brendel was secretly amused. He had figured out that this young lady's temper was quite easy to deal with. She was indeed a tsundere. He pursed his lips and continued to complete the formation. Spatial magic was one of the most complicated formations in the world. Brando had repeatedly discussed the feasibility of this plan with the great Druid Elder before he carried it out. In the end, they decided to use a runic formation to determine the coordinates. The ones who actually cast the spell were the great druids of the Withering Tree Council. The problem with this method was the coordinates of the spell and the conduction of the spell across tens of kilometers. The first problem was not difficult to solve. Brando himself knew alchemy, so drawing a runic formation was not a big problem. He memorized the runic formation scroll given to him by the great Druid Elder and did not even bring a sample of the runic formation with him. Green fragmented agate was used to conduct magic. This type of high-grade crystal was produced in the Mountain of Quelled Storms and had a rare resonance attribute. This attribute was actually a low-grade spatial phenomenon, and was used by wizards as a medium to conduct magic in many situations. However, no one could guarantee the success of a long-distance spell that was tens of kilometers long because the plan itself carried a certain degree of risk. The Druids were prepared to either succeed or die trying. They seemed to have placed all their hopes on this plan. Of course, Brando knew that the druids had actually transferred a group of young and old druids to the withering tree when the calamity of wolves began. This was to be the seed and inheritance left behind in case the resistance failed. That was why he pretended that he did not see it. However, Brando knew that this plan was not as dangerous as the druids thought. In the game, players had also succeeded in long-distance spell transmission, and it was not just once. There were many successful examples in the later battles. What's more, the highest number of fragmented agates a player could use was 6. The lowest number of fragmented agates used was 1. In fact, an expert on the forum deduced that 4 fragmented agates was enough to guarantee a 97% success rate. The druids provided a total of 12 fragmented agates, which was more than enough. However, Brando only planned to use 4 of them, and the rest would naturally fill his pockets. Fragmented agates were extremely rare, and if he missed this opportunity, he might not be able to take advantage of it in the future. He set up the formation and pointed at the center of the formation with the tip of his sword. In the name of the storm and time, I beseech the Lord between the 3rd and 7th stars to let the mysterious power pass through the night sky, in the name of magic, Dallas Tier. The young man's voice was so loud that it echoed in the valley. Dallas Tier, Vahina was shocked. She turned around and saw the formation under Brando's sword suddenly emitting a misty green light. The green light flowed like liquid and filled every line of the runic formation. What kind of magic is this? Country bumpkin, you actually asked for help from the dragon of time and storm, Dallas Tier. That's a superior dragon. How could you cast such a high-level spell? It's a spatial spell, but I'm not the one who cast it. It's just a coordinate formation. Brando did not intend to hide anything this time. He looked up and saw 3 or 4 green lines streaking across the sky. Behind the clouds, the edge of the huge gear in the sky seemed to be turning. It was a sign that the laws were responding to magic. Spatial spell. But you're asking for help from the dragon of time and storm. Spatial spell. Spatial spell. Vahina suddenly could not remember what level of authorization one would need for spatial spells. She did not understand such a high-level domain at all. All spatial spells require authorization from the dragon of time and storm. Don't you know that? Brando turned around and glanced at her. Of course I know. I'm just asking. Vahina's face turned red. Oh. Vahina's face turned even redder. She angrily said, so why is that? Mistress, has no one ever told you that you have a bad temper? Brando shook his head and sighed. Time and space are one, it's just that they exist in different dimensions. What he was talking about was, in fact, a theory of the Silver School. The founder of the theory was William Pisht, a master of spatial magic. It was said that no one had studied the void behind the world of Vaunt more intensely than he had. But just as Brando finished speaking, an old voice suddenly exclaimed, young man, where did you hear that from? Brando and Vahina were startled and turned around at the same time. But they could only see that the place where the voice came from was empty. Brando frowned and suddenly looked in that direction. Are you from the Silver Alliance? Why don't you show yourself? The old voice let out a series of hearty laughter. Ha, young man, your reaction is fast. But your provocation won't work on an old man like me. Even though he said that, the old man still dispelled his invisibility spell and revealed himself. Brando narrowed his eyes when he saw the old man in a silver robe. William Pisht, one of the 12 silver leaders of the Buga Magi. Some said he was 300 years old, while others said he was 400 years old. His legend was not only among the Buga Magi, but also among the commoners. There was even a poet named Colgo who wrote a book called The Story of a Great Magus, sponsored by Colgo and published by Bista. As for Bista, he was a rather famous merchant near Ampere Seal. According to the locals, merchants like him were always interested in doing strange things. Of course, it was because of this merchant's whimsy that the story of William Pish spread among the commoners. But when Brando looked at the old man, he couldn't help but think maliciously. Did he go to Colgo to collect copyright fees or other related fees? When William saw Brando's eyes, he knew that the old man had recognized him. The old man couldn't help but show some surprise in his eyes. You recognize me? Many people know you, sir. One of the 12 silver circles, master of Kanaki, respected leader of the Magi. Brando replied. I didn't know I had so many titles, the old man smiled. But they've only heard of my name. Not many can recognize me. Let me think, you also know about the integration of space and time. William narrowed his eyes. This theory of the Silver School was created by him, but it was still immature and didn't receive much recognition. Even a few of his old friends didn't necessarily agree with his theory. He didn't expect to meet a young man who could casually say it out loud, and with a confident look on his face. This made him more and more interested. You, at this time, Faina finally reacted and realized who the person in front of her was. She looked at William in disbelief and was speechless for a moment. It seems like this little girl also recognizes this old bag of bones. What an honor. Brando couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. What is this old man doing here? He knew that the Magi from Buga were here, but he didn't know that the one who came was a leader of the Magi. This person's strength was probably on par with Andesha. Don't worry, William seemed to have seen through his worries and smiled. I'm just curious. Curious. To be continued. If you want to know more, please go to www.chidian.com. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 442. Curious. A small noble from the border who knows Ekis, the alpha wolf, knows Dalister's spatial runic array, and even has the sword of earth and mountains, a gift from the dragon god. The sword in your hand is the azure firmament, right? The old man looked at Brando with his gray-green eyes and smiled wisely. Brando's heart skipped a beat. Can't a small noble have these? That's prejudiced. Sometimes you have to admit that prejudices are also an experience, William said with a smile. But it seems like these are your secrets. Forgive me for being rude. If I apologize to you, you won't make things difficult for an old man like me, right? Brando couldn't help but smile at William's witty words. At least William's amiable attitude was much better than the arrogant Cruz people. Theoretically speaking, as the leader of the Silver Folk, he had more reason to look down on the Iron Folk. But compared to the modesty and politeness of the wizards, the Cruz people were pathetic nouveau riche. Well, actually I'm more concerned about this. The old man looked up at the majestic stone door and shook his head. Behind this door is definitely not the resting place of the Lionheart sword. Everyone guessed wrong. He turned around, his gray-green eyes flashing with a strange light. But if I'm not wrong, you know what's behind this door, right? Brando didn't believe that William came here out of curiosity, but he still asked, Wizard, what's the basic principle of magic? This question was as simple as eating and drinking to William. He answered without thinking, it's the exchange of magic power and law. I've heard that the symbol of the Silver Union is a silver scale. Can you tell me the reason behind this, Sir Adept? William's eyes flashed. An exchange of equal value. Good boy, I understand. What do you want? Just do me a favor. I understand. You want me to help you stop that woman, right? The old man looked at the other side of the valley. It's a little troublesome, but it's not out of the question. Brando nodded. He didn't doubt William's ability to guess his thoughts. The wizard leader's long life was not only wise, but also experienced enough to understand the truth of many things. The old man smiled. It's a difficult deal, but I think it's worth it. Now, can you tell me what's behind this door? Valhalla, Brando answered. William was a little startled. You mean the ruins of the goddess that the Druids talked about? Brando nodded. He wasn't worried that the legendary wizard leader would meddle in this matter, because in most people's minds, Valhalla was a primitive flame. Obtaining this fire seed would immediately make one a lord of a region, but the attraction of this point was to stand on the side of power. It didn't mean much to a wizard at the top. Besides, Bugge was an alliance of floating cities. The craftsmen of Bugge didn't have any concept of territory, nor did they need it. Moreover, in the camp of order, this great wizard was on the same side as him. Legend has it that in the south of Erewhon, there's a primitive flame left behind by Martha. I've only heard rumors about it, but I didn't expect it to be in the center of the loop of trade winds. William looked at the majestic stone door and sighed. Is it behind this door? Brando nodded. It's amazing. The old man turned his head. But now I'm even more curious. This is a legend recorded in the secret texts of the Druids. How did you know about it? Brando smiled but didn't answer. I understand. Is this a secret? Brando nodded. At the same time, in the Green Tower's Withering Tree Council, the Druids were bitterly waiting for the final moment to arrive. Outside the hall, lightning flashed and thunder roared. It was so frequent that it was as if it wasn't raining but thunder. Streaks of white lightning flashed through the rainy night, illuminating the faces of the Druids. The howling wolves had entered the upper levels of the Green Tower, and the battle was unfolding in the market area. The centaurs and tree elves had lost the market the night before, but they took it back at noon yesterday. Both sides had engaged in a battle of vines and branches for more than 10 hours. The Druids retreated because they didn't have enough soldiers. The wolves seemed to be endless. The hourglass in the center of the hall was turning for the last time. It would turn for about 4 hours each time, but to the Druids, these 4 hours were the longest of their lives. They still had one last chance, but the road to destruction was clear. Everyone was looking forward to it. A few elite Druids used thorny vines to block the roads leading to the City Hall, but once the City Hall fell, the Withering Tree Council would be the only place left for the Green Tower to defend. Ordinary civilians who had fled from other areas gathered anxiously in the few remaining open spaces in the last area of the city. Adults hugged their children, and men comforted women. The air was filled with a suffocating tension and uneasiness. Only the sound of the rain could be heard. In the Withering Tree Council. At first, the Druids in the hall were still discussing, but when the young Druid beside the Great Elder turned the hourglass, the hall became eerily silent. Everyone seemed to have finished what they wanted to say or didn't know what to say. The discussion stopped. In a few hours, if that young human doesn't send back news, the Green Tower's fire seed will be extinguished. A voice in the hall said. Perhaps he's already dead. I object. The fire seed is still shining. That's fire seed, I recognize it. Everyone couldn't help but look behind the rain. In the darkness, there was only a faint green beam of light that pierced through the rain and into the clouds. But the beam of light hasn't moved for a long time. Perhaps they're in trouble. Even if they leave now, they won't be able to reach the center of the loop of trade winds in a few hours. The buzzing of discussion once again sounded, but because of this sentence, the uneasiness in everyone's hearts seemed to have been pointed out. Even the stooped Great Elder frowned. But at this moment, a voice came from outside the hole. Perhaps that young human isn't dead yet. He's already here. Everyone turned around in surprise and saw a tall figure walking out of the rain. He took off his wet clothes and revealed a rugged face. It was the great Druid Andrew, who had yet to return from the loop of storms. Andrew, you're back. We thought you'd return to the embrace of the forest. When the calamity of wolves happened, I was behind the pass of wolves, so I escaped, Andrew replied. When I realized that something was wrong, I turned into a raven and patrolled the forest. Only then did I realize that something had happened. I wasn't sure then, but now I can confirm that the young human isn't lying. This time, the demonic wave is different. Yes, the great elder nodded and looked at Andrew, but you must have discovered something else since you've stayed in the forest until now. Andrew's sudden appearance brought confidence to everyone, but in such a situation, it was still not easy. They were eager to get something from the latter. They wanted to hear more good news, so they focused their attention on the great druid. Andrew nodded. I wandered around the forest for a period of time to investigate the scale of the calamity of wolves. But I don't think I need to repeat myself. Everyone has seen it. It's just that I met Quinn in the forest and learned a few things from him. You met that young human. Everyone was shocked. No, I said I met Quinn and saved a few human nobles along the way, but I didn't meet the Lord. What's going on? Someone immediately asked, aren't they together? They seem to have met with some trouble. The Lord has left alone and is heading to the center of the loop of trade winds. Alone? The great elder frowned. Then are you sure he's already at the center of the loop of trade winds? No, I'm not, Andrew shrugged. I came back to report the news because your guesses were wrong. There are a few descendants of Fenrir who have the ability to fly. If I didn't come back, I'm afraid I'd be in trouble. The hall fell silent. Descendants of the demonic wolves. The great elder's brows furrowed. We have to prepare our defenses. If the demonic wolves with the ability to fly invade from the sky, the city hall's defenses will be in danger. Someone immediately reacted. However, his order did not receive any response. Everyone was more or less wavering. That young human was nowhere to be found. Was there any meaning in making a final struggle? It would be better to let those young humans with potential turn into ravens and fly away. There were not many descendants of Fenrir who could fly yet. At this moment, another voice came from outside the hall. I wonder if everyone is still in the mood to meet a guest at this time. Guest? What guest would there be at this time? Everyone was stunned. If it's a guest, please come in. The great elder calmed himself down and spoke loudly. Tolman parted the curtain of rain and walked in. He held a silver staff with 6 runes revolving around it and smiled at everyone. The scholars stood there calmly, as if the calamity of wolves did not exist. Perhaps it made people feel that this person did not fit in with this world. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 443. After Tolman walked in, everyone fell silent. A wizard from Buga. No, I'm here on behalf of Erwin, Tolman replied. What do you mean? The great elder frowned. As long as the Witherwood Council survives, it's only a matter of time before the Green Tower is rebuilt. The mana wave is only temporary. A stable order can only be built after a long period of struggle and repeated failures. Are you going to help us? Someone asked. Tolman shook his head and spoke bluntly. Let's just say that Erwin needs a stable defensive line in the south. If the druids of the Loop of Trade Winds are wiped out, the dark forest will spread to my homeland. Erwin can no longer afford to lose the south of Ampere Seal. So you're going to stay and help us defend against the calamity of wolves? No, my abilities are limited. I can only take you with me, Tolman smiled. I've already drawn the magic circle. It's in the inn where I'm staying. Of course, setting up a magic circle in the room without the owner's permission is a little rude. I'll apologize for that later. However, I'm afraid that I won't be able to do that. Now, what do you think of my suggestion? Leave. Everyone fell silent. Leaving the Green Tower immediately meant giving up on it. Although it was only a matter of time before the Green Tower was rebuilt, they couldn't bear the thought of losing hundreds of years of hard work. How would they face the spirits of their ancestors if they did that? It would be better for them to die in this battle. It would be better for them to die in this battle. However, this Silver Union adept was right. Giving up now was not the same as giving up forever. As such, there were still some who were tempted. How many people can you take with you? The Great Elder asked calmly. 100, no more. Tolman replied. Everyone sucked in a breath of cold air. They were shocked by the Great Wizard's strength, but it also meant that other than these 100 people, the rest of them could only wait for death. If everyone could die, then there would be nothing to say. However, if some of them could survive, it would be too cruel. For others, it would be too cruel. Everyone had a reason to live. What right did the rest of them have to choose who they wanted to live on? The hall was so silent that one could hear a pin drop. Finally, someone made the final decision. Let the young people leave. They are the hope of the future. Even though the Druids had sent away most of the elderly and children, they had left behind many talented youths. This was to ensure that the Green Tower's remaining forces would remain intact. Everyone knew that as long as the elites were transferred away, the city hall's defensive line would be riddled with holes like a leaky wall. Even so, Tolman still said, young people are not enough. They also need experienced people to guide them. You don't want them to repeat your past mistakes, do you? It's best if there are 1 or 2 elders in this team. That way, the Green Tower can be rebuilt quickly. The hall fell silent again. Everyone looked at the Great Elder. However, the Great Elder said, let me remind you all. Don't forget that we have an agreement with that young lord from the human world. Everyone was stunned. They didn't expect the Great Elder to suddenly say such words. Only Andrew looked at the stooped old man who was much shorter than everyone else in the room with admiration. He slightly puffed out his chest, as if he was infected by the words and felt a little proud. It was a kind of arrogance. The Great Elder's words represented the Druids' beliefs. Even though they were alone in the dark forest and were not known to outsiders, it was only to uphold the oath they had made 1,000 years ago. A true Druid would never forget their oath. When the golden bloodline was lost to the land, when the silver bloodline was lost, when the descendants of the 4 wise ones were corrupted, and when the land was plunged into the flames of war and pain. Only the Druids would forever stand on the front lines to protect the order of the world because of their sacred oath with Martha. Because they would never lose their oath. I also object. A crisp voice spoke up. Everyone turned around and saw a young girl with a tense expression standing in the middle of the crowd. Sifrid, we have an agreement with Brother Brando, and we must abide by it. If we abandon it today, then we will. One day, we will also abandon everything that we have been holding on to. The hall fell silent for a moment. Tolman clapped his hands lightly. Well said. Mr. Wizard, this doesn't seem to be in line with your position, does it? Andrew questioned. I stand on what I believe to be right, Tolman smiled, but that does not stop me from appreciating other people's positions. Right and wrong are relative, but those who stand firm are worthy of my respect. But then again, what will you choose now? He continued to ask. I will stay here. Sifrid was the first to speak up. Her expression was so resolute that it did not seem like a young girl's. Why don't you listen to the opinions of the others first, little girl? You must be cautious when it comes to important matters. Tolman replied. You know me. I've heard some rumors. The scholar did not mince her words. But I'm only representing myself. Sifrid frowned. But little girl, because of your position, your words will decide the fate of many people. Do you understand? That's too sly of you. Tolman smiled, but the Grand Elder stopped him from speaking. Mr. Wizard, let's get back to the topic. Sifrid is still young, and it is not a bad thing for her to preserve her innocence and kindness. Tolman nodded. So, what is the Grand Elder's answer to me? The old man's back was hunched, and he appeared to be hesitant. Sifrid stood beside him and pursed her lips tightly. She stared at Tolman as if he was an enemy. She instinctively felt that this mysterious old man's intentions were not good for her brother Brando. If the druids gave up, then what about Hazen? What about her brother Brando in the forest? However, Tolman also blocked her words, making her unable to open her mouth. Most of the other druids also kept their mouths shut and looked at the Grand Elder and the other druids with inquiring eyes. Everyone's opinions were different, and even their hearts were wavering. On one hand, it was giving up on the possibility of the future. On the other hand, it was giving up on the promise. It was fine to keep the promise. But wouldn't it be pedantic to go against the will of the order for the sake of a promise? Lady Martha, please enlighten us on what we should do. Many of them could not help but have such thoughts. At this moment, a bright flash of lightning streaked across the night sky, illuminating everyone's faces. At this moment, a trembling voice cried out, "The runestone is moving." Everyone's eyes turned to the center of the hall. There was a huge magic formation there, and the runestone at the center of the formation was suddenly activated. Green light flowed across the surface of the runestone, drawing out a mysterious pattern. Then, the entire magic formation lit up. The druids and high-ranked druids around the formation began to channel their mana into the runestone. Storm in the sky, in the name of Dalastair, heed our call. Tolman was startled when he saw this scene. This is. The huge magic formation was already activated. Green light pierced through the clouds and intersected with the coordinates 100 miles away. Then, a blurry figure flashed across the magic formation. It was Brando. The scholar from Silverhold raised his eyebrows when he saw the young man. Then he saw Bran. William was even more surprised when he saw Brendel. Thank the heavens, it seems that Mother Marcia has not forgotten about this insignificant existence of mine. This magic formation can still be used. Brendel stood on the other side of the light. His voice was a little distorted, and the moment he spoke, people could not help but frown. What did he mean by, "Seems that Mother Marcia has not forgotten about this insignificant existence of mine"? This magic formation can still be used. But his next words made the druids forget about their slight disrespect towards Lady Martha and their magic. Elders, I have good news for you. I have found the entrance to Valhalla. Next, I'll have to trouble you to send Sifrid over. We're just one step away from victory. Everyone in the hall heaved a sigh of relief. Tolman raised an eyebrow when he heard about Valhalla. He wanted to say something, but William, who was standing behind Brando, signaled him with his eyes. The scholar smiled faintly and immediately shut his mouth. Only the Grand Elder was able to maintain his composure. He took a deep breath and asked, "About time. How long will it take?" "I'm not sure," Brando shook his head. "No one has tried it before, but I'm afraid it won't be easy to open the door." Even though it was expected, the druids still frowned. "You only have 4 hours, young man." At this moment, Tolman finally spoke. He looked at the others and asked, "In such a short time, can you guarantee that you can overcome all difficulties and save this city from the calamity of wolves?" "Of course Brother Brando can." Sifrid stood up and said. She could not tolerate Tolman questioning Brando in front of everyone. But Tolman did not care about the girl's words and only looked at Brendel. The latter was startled when he saw Tolman standing in the middle of the crowd. He was shocked and blurted out, "Grandmaster Tolman, why are you here?" Brendel suddenly realized something and immediately shut his mouth, but Tolman was already smiling with an "I understand" expression. "Looks like you've known me for a long time. Then I won't hold it against you about the little joke you played with me last time. Why don't you answer my question first?" Brando raised an eyebrow nonchalantly. He knew that Tolman would not really come looking for trouble with him. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.cheatyin.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 444. Grandmaster Tolman, are you asking this because you want to help Erwin? Brendel could not help but raise his eyebrows as he looked at the scholar who could be ranked in the top 3 in the Amber Sword. Very clever, but that's not the answer I want. Brando paused. I don't know, but I can only try. Brando shook his head. Do you have any suggestions, Grandmaster? I have a better suggestion. Tolman looked at Brando. Rather than placing our hopes in uncertain possibilities, why don't we choose a safer method? Don't you think so, young man? We don't have the right to put anyone in danger to gamble on a 1 in a million chance. I'll bet on gold, but you're betting on a person's life. Brother Brando won't do that. Sifrid felt like she was about to explode from anger. Using bewitching words to sway people's hearts. That's just how you mysterious fellows do it. Even Vahina, who was on the other side of the light, could not help but snort. Of course, she did not know who Tolman was. If she knew that Tolman was on equal footing with William in the Argent Society, she would not have dared to reprimand Tolman even if she was given 1,000 guts. In fact, even Vahina herself found it strange. She clearly wanted to stab Brando with her sword, but when she heard the old man's sinister words, she could not help but stand up and mock him. It was as if she subconsciously thought that she was on the same side as Brando. It was as if she was standing on the same side as him. But after she said that, she snorted softly, as if to say, I just don't like that old man. I didn't expect you to speak up for me. Brendel teased her as if he was trying to make things difficult for her. Vahina's face turned red all the way to her neck. She wanted nothing more than to jump over and strangle Brando, but before she could do that, she reflexively retorted. He retorted, You, what nonsense are you spouting? It's not like that. Brando smiled but did not say anything. He turned around and looked at Tolman. Among so many people, he was the only one who truly understood the intention of the great scholar. He was indeed as calm and wise as he remembered, but he did not expect him to have such an idea. But it was understandable. Brando even thought it might be a mistake. There was a setting similar to insurance in the storyline. Even if the players failed the quest, the Withered Tree Council and the entire southern region of Erewhon could be preserved temporarily. Is this the so-called inertia of history? However, Brando smiled. What I want to save is lives, so I'm betting with lives. I'm putting myself in the most dangerous situation as the price. This is very fair. You're brave, but you can't expect everyone to be as brave as you. But I can ask for the treatment of the brave. Brando raised his head and answered without avoiding Tolman's gaze. Tolman paused for a moment, then smiled. The hall was so quiet that even the sound of a pin dropping could be heard. The young human lord's words were very clear, as if they were powerful and resonating. Those words could not help but feel ashamed. Only the great elder looked at Brando and nodded. The great scholar. Looking at his old friend William, the two of them exchanged a tacit glance. Interesting. All right, young man. You've convinced me. I'll give you some time. Tolman turned around and looked at all the druids in the hall. What about all of you? Now, this little fellow has sent you an invitation. He said that only the brave can join this game. Now, you can tell me. Tell me, what is your choice? The old man's voice echoed in the hall. Most of them answered the question with their eyes. Brando's ever-present confidence infected everyone. Even Vahina could not help but be startled. She looked at Brando's side profile and could not help but fall into a daze. This Erewhon country bumpkin does not seem to be so incompetent. At the very least, he looks very handsome. In the Withering Tree Council, the Great Elder patted Sifrid's shoulder and everyone opened up a path for her. The druid standing beside the magic circle began to cast the spell. The light from the circle became more and more dazzling, and it was at this time that Tolman looked at William on the other side of the light. He suddenly spoke in his mind. Valhalla, it seems like you've discovered something incredible, old friend. He did not open his mouth, but the conversation between the two was completed on the mental level. It's not me. I'm just a bystander. William replied. But if we ignite the ancient fire seed, the Green Tower will indeed be preserved. Tolman said. You're wrong. Erewhon will obtain another territory because of this. You're saying that I should agree to this plan. Didn't you already agree to it? Not entirely. You know, I hate that possibility. There's another reason, William smiled. The nine-headed phoenix once said that a man's wealth is his own ruin. Indeed. But why did you signal me to agree? Tolman asked. Humph. Did you see those druids? I can even hear them asking. The druids have never betrayed their oath. What about you, citizens of the Silver Empire? Tolman smiled faintly at William's ridicule. That's why I agreed. No matter what, we're on the same side of order. The humans are willing to fall, but the citizens of the Silver Empire cannot follow suit. The demon wave this time is already making me feel uneasy. I'm even starting to suspect the Dark Dragon. I'm afraid that the prophecy is not empty threats. Humans are willing to fall. I'm afraid that's not entirely the case. William looked at Brendel and smiled. But it's also nonsense to believe that the Dark Dragon will be resurrected. You and I should know best what kind of existence the Dark Dragon is. Tolman shook his head and did not refute William's words. But it seemed that he did not fully agree with William's words. At this time, Sifrid had already walked into the magic circle. After a dazzling white light, the runestone in the center of the magic circle suddenly exploded, and the druids around it fell to the ground. But this was the normal reaction of a magic circle. The runestone could not withstand the huge energy fluctuation caused by the teleportation and shattered. It was one of the main characteristics of magic formations that allowed the caster to bear the effects of the spell's backlash. Because of the huge magic reaction, the lights in the hall dimmed for a moment. Before anyone realized that the magic circle had succeeded, Andrew suddenly shouted, "All right. Hurry up and reinforce the city hall's defensive line. Don't let the descendants of Fenrir break in so easily." The druids who were dizzy from the explosion were startled for a moment, but they quickly reacted. The hall immediately became noisy as people ran around. The council was in a mess, and they could not help but frown. But no matter what, the morale that was previously low due to pessimism and despair was now gone. It was as if everyone's courage had been ignited, and they longed for courage and glory. The Great Elder looked at this scene and could not help but hit the wooden staff in his hand with his finger. He let out a soft sigh. Unbelievable. Not only do the druids believe in a human from the outside world, but they are also inspired by a human. Tolman came to the Great Elder's side and said with a sigh. A firm heart is universal. When people see that the strongest person has not fallen, they will also become strong. But it's a pity. The Great Elder was slightly startled and turned his head. It seems that wisdom cannot be transmitted. Otherwise, that little guy would at least become smarter after seeing me. At least ask me to teleport that little girl over and not waste your limited strength. Tolman looked at the druids who had collapsed in the hall and said in a mocking tone. It could be seen that the high-grade druids had exhausted their mana. The Great Elder's expression suddenly became interesting. On the other side, Brendel caught Sifrid as she fell from the magic formation and sneezed loudly. He did not expect a great scholar to speak ill of him behind his back, and thought that it was either Seal or Romaine who had secretly pinned him with a scarecrow. Of course, it was one of the two. The latter was more suspicious. He rubbed his nose and put Sifrid down. The little girl raised her head and stared at him with a face full of admiration. You intend to let this little girl open the gate of Valhalla? William looked at Sifrid and suddenly realized something. So that's how it is. The daughter of the forest. Brando nodded. So the rumors are true. The fire seat of Valhalla is in the hands of the daughter of the forest, waiting for the day she awakens from her slumber. Today, the prophecy has come true. No wonder Tumen suddenly said those words to me. William nodded in realization. But you know how to open the door. Do you know the method? Brando shook his head. Of course he did not. The guide did not mention this part at all. He thought that he could enter Valhalla with Sifrid, but he did not expect there to be another gate here. I'm going to give it a try. It shouldn't be too difficult. Brando replied as he thought of the player in history. The great wizard raised an eyebrow. I see. But I advise you to hurry up. The old man turned his head and looked at the other side of the valley. That woman seems to have escaped from her troubles. I think it's your turn next. Brendel's expression changed, but he quickly replied, I seem to remember that there's an agreement between us, Lord Wizard. William nodded with a faint smile. Not only that, I can also give you an additional service. What do you mean? Brando was startled. That is to tell you that there's more than one person here. More than one person. What does that mean? There's someone else here. Brando held Sifrid with one hand and was truly stunned this time. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 445. Brando did not expect Andesha to have a helper here. Even though the old man said that there were people on the other side of the fog who might not necessarily be on the tree herder's side, it did not mean that they were good people. In any case, this was not good news. How much time do I have, Master William? Brendel turned around and asked. The old man's wise gaze pierced through the fog and looked at the other side of the valley. He casually opened a dimensional hole in the air and took out a silver staff. Andesha seems to have been frightened by Akis, but she is still the lord of the tree herders. I believe that she will react quickly. You only have a few minutes. Brando nodded. William's words meant that he did not have much time left, and he had to open the gate to Valhalla before Andesha reacted. He turned around and saw the gate of Valhalla standing between the valley and the valley. This man-made stone wall was so majestic that it was built by the great craftsman Darua and his many ancestors. The ancient black stone wall that had existed for 13,000 years seemed to have passed through the dust of history and laws. It quietly sat there and reappeared in their vision. Behind the pervasive fog, according to the epic, the gate was engraved with poems praising light and fire in many languages. At this moment, those strange words were engraved on the cold black wall, and the mysterious patterns looked like the sky that was hanging upside down. Gazing at the sky gave people the illusion that it would collapse at any moment, and it brought with it a suffocating pressure. The three of them slowly approached the giant gate and placed their hands on the carefully carved masterpiece. The cold stone responded with a power that shook their hearts, as if it was a breath of warmth left behind from thousands of years ago. Swords, spears, and halberds crisscrossed, and the sounds of battle filled the five senses. It was as if blood was smeared all over the place, dripping down from the black stone and the dry earth. Finally, the bell of destiny on the Pendulum Island rang, and a green pillar of light shot into the sky. The dragon spread its wings and blocked out the light of the sun. The darkness brought about the next era. Brando shook his head and suddenly woke up from the illusion. The heavy weight of history made it difficult for him to breathe. His forehead was glistening, and cold sweat dripped down his forehead. He turned around and looked into the old man's silver-gray eyes. William smiled. Not everyone knows about this part of history. The azure night shattered the sky and brought us a new world. The twilight dragon fell to the earth, and the long suffering ended, but people also lost their honor. The old man said with a smile. If this was in the game, Brando might have been interested in adding, the suffering did not end, and people did not lose their honor. There is always oppression in this world, and heroes do not exist in people's imaginations. This was a standard answer to inspire the story. But Brando was not in the mood to discuss the legends of the past and the difficult times of the present with the leader of the Silver Alliance. He had long since passed the age of Chinibu, and there was no need for him to be a hipster. Compared to that, the gleaming sword on his back made him feel more pressed for time. Especially now that the sword was in the hands of the enemy, and Endesha was closing in on him. Sifrit, do you feel anything? He glanced at William pissed for a moment before turning back to Sifrit. I feel a voice calling out to me, Brother Brando. Sifrit closed her eyes and spoke nervously. Her fair hands were placed on the black stone, and the contrast was a little strong. What is it saying? The key to the door, the light of the stars, the heroic spirit of the ancient times, the guardian king. This is a sentence from the Druid's Thorn poem. Perhaps it's a code. Did the Druids teach you this? No, I only learned the nature's way. Brother Brando. That's all you learned in 3 months. I am sorry, it's fine, it's not your fault. Even the Great Schism did not change these damned fellows' ability to waste time. Brando resisted the urge to curse. Perhaps their lifespans are too long, and they have learned the bad habits of the elves. You know a lot about the druids and the elves? William asked calmly. This young man always surprised him. But Brando did not have time to answer him. He was trying to recall some information and strategies about Valhalla. Because it was too long ago, his memories were already blurry. He could only remember fragments, but he had to rely on these fragments to save his life. I don't know if this is it, Brando replied. You are the key to the door, Sifrit. Tell it that you are the one who walks on the earth with the scepter of forests and mountains. You are the daughter of God who has given authority among the mortals. You are the chosen one who is favored by the ancient heroic spirits. Sifrit stared at him with wide eyes. William also grabbed his silver goatee with one hand and narrowed his eyes as he watched this scene. Just repeat after me. Spirit of the door. Spirit of the gate. Sifrit took a deep breath and chanted out loud, I am the one who walks the earth with the scepter of the forest and the mountains. I am the daughter of the gods, the chosen one blessed by the heroic spirits of the past. The two of them echoed each other. The little girl's voice was young, but it was filled with infinite power. So. The door suddenly rumbled, and a loud voice came in response. The voice was like rolling thunder, piercing through the fog in everyone's heart. Sifrit's eyes lit up. She looked at her brother Brando in disbelief. Brendel, it's speaking. Faina cried out in shock. William narrowed his eyes slightly. His silver eyes narrowed into a line. So? Sifrit asked in confusion. So please open your door. Brando said. Please open your door. Sifrit shouted. Her voice echoed in the valley, but this time the door did not budge. What's wrong? Faina asked. The conditions are wrong. Brando furrowed his brows. The words on the forums flashed through his mind like lightning, but the more nervous he was, the more blurry the words became. After all, that was almost 10 years ago. The old man turned his head around, and his subtle movement did not escape Faina's eyes. She became anxious. Hurry up, shut up," Brendel said in annoyance. "You?" Vahina glared at him, but she knew very well who was in charge here. Moreover, her life was in his hands, so she could only turn her head away and keep quiet. "Brother Brando, the door is talking to me," Sifrid suddenly said. "What?" Brando was surprised. "What is it talking about?" "It's asking me where the sovereign is." "Where is the sovereign?" Brando's eyes lit up. He suddenly understood and placed his hand on the wall. "So that's how it is. The sovereign is the only master of Valhalla, the ruler of the forest and the mountains. As the daughter of the forest, Sifrid is the keeper of the scepter of the forest and the mountains. But one day, the keeper will have to return the scepter to its master. The sovereign who wields the scepter rules over the vast lands beneath Valhalla and the Valhalla mountain, just like the legend described." Brando placed his hand on the wall and spoke in his mind, "Frowny face, O heroic spirits and sovereigns of the past, I am willing to take over your swords and protect this land. Let the darkness no longer cover the land, and let order break through the fog of chaos. If this is a responsibility, please let me take over this heavy responsibility. If this is a crown of glory, please crown me personally. Because this light will break through the layers of clouds and sprinkle upon the land. It's just like what our ancestors saw in the dark wilderness. Even after 1,000 years, the sacred oath will still hold." He did not know why, but when he spoke these lines from the game, they felt as heavy as a mountain, as if 1,000 pounds were carved into his heart. The door remained silent for a moment. Then an old voice spoke, "Frowny face, I hope so, my successor." Brando and Sifrid felt an invisible force pushing them away from the door. They took a step back and looked up at the huge door. A faint noise came from within the huge door. It sounded like rolling thunder from the clouds. At first, it was so faint that it could not be heard, but it gradually grew louder and louder, turning into a boundless wave that rumbled together. The ground trembled. The broken pieces of stone trembled on the black ground, as if a clown was dancing on the obsidian ground, crazily waving its hands and feet, making cracking sounds. Vahina was so frightened that she bumped into a rock, but she did not notice it. Even the wizard leader William could not help but squint his eyes to witness this magnificent scene. The huge stone door slowly opened a crack. It was pitch black behind the crack, and a gust of wind blew out from within, causing everyone's hair to flutter. But the wind did not have the smell of dust and mold, only a heavy aura. It was the kind of heavy aura that came from between the stone walls and the dust. His surroundings quieted down. It was as if there was a terrifying monster hiding behind the door. Brendel sucked in a deep breath. "We're not going in, are we?" "Brando." Vahina stammered as she stared at the dark space behind the crack. She stared at the door. When the door opened, it let out a long sound, as if it came from the dark abyss. It completely destroyed her psychological defense, causing the girl's face to turn white. "You don't have to go in. There might be a monster even more terrifying than Endesha inside," Brando said as he put away azure skies and unsheathed Halran Gaia from his back. Why you're scaring me." "I won't be scared." Vahina was on the verge of tears. Brando glanced at her and patted Sifrid's shoulder, then brought her into the room. "Grand Master William." Vahina looked at Brando as he walked into the room and turned back pitifully. "Little girl, your lord is right. No one knows what kind of dangers lie in the ancient ruins. You might think that the danger you faced before was a kind of mercy. He's not my lord." "Oh, that's right. If that's the case, then you don't have to worry about his safety." The old wizard smiled and raised his staff, preparing to enter the room. The noble lady's face turned red and white, but she could only grit her teeth and follow after Brendel and the old mage, one after the other, walked into the room. She did not know if Brando was trying to scare her, but the hidden threat was nothing compared to the real danger. It was common knowledge that humans were smart creatures. Besides, the old man is right. Even though he's not related to me, he did save my life. I can't just leave him like that. At least, my pride as a Cruz will not allow me to do so. Why, you're right. Vahina only needed a second to convince herself. To be continued. If you like this novel, you're welcome to vote for it at Chidian. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 446. Scarlet. The soft call seemed to be lower than the howling wind outside. The red-haired girl looked up. Veronica was sitting not far from her. The two hid in the natural shelter formed by the recessed black rocks. This kind of terrain was not uncommon in this area that was shrouded in wind and sand all year round. Veronica seemed to want to break the silence, but she did not know where to start. The girl in front of her had a strong sense of wariness towards her. It was not Scarlet's fault. After all, they were enemies before. But the female Legion commander chose to speak in the end. Scarlet blinked her beautiful amber eyes and looked at the noblewoman from the Cruz Empire with doubts. The relationship between the two seemed to have changed from hostility to a subtle relationship of mutual dependence. She could not help but feel that it was unreal. Of course, more than that, she was uneasy. This uneasiness did not come from the fear and nervousness of her situation, but from the concern of leaving the Lord. The uneasiness was reflected in the girl's expression through the subtle refraction of her expression. Her eyebrows were slightly wrinkled, and her eyes were full of worry. Veronica sighed, "You don't have to worry too much. Your lord will be safe." The comforting words more or less made the girl relax a little. At least her hands were no longer clenched into fists. Then the female Legion commander showed a kind smile. There is a saying in the Cruz army. A young man with a tough life is favored by the stars in the sky. It is said that a child who came to this world on a certain night when the bright galaxy stretched across the sky is the child of the stars. The child of the stars is favored by luck and can always turn misfortune into blessings. I think he has the potential. Scarlet did not understand why Veronica suddenly said this to her. She stared at the female senior in disbelief, as if questioning, is there really such a legend in the Cruz army? The distance between the two was shortened a lot. Where are you from? Veronica suddenly asked. Scarlet whispered the word, and suddenly became alert. She looked at the lady with suspicion in her eyes. But the latter shook her head and could not help but laugh softly. You don't have to be nervous. I'm just curious. She tilted her head and looked at her in confusion. Veronica shook her head. Even though she was already over 100 years old, the goddess of war still retained her youthful vigor. It would not be an exaggeration to say that she was a stunning beauty. However, at this moment, she sat on the sand, looking a little tired. If there is only one genius in 100 people, then your liege must be someone who only appears once in 1,000 years. Actually, I don't doubt his future achievements, but I'm just curious. Can such a person really appear in the border province of a small country? Brando said that he's a small lord at the border of Erewhon, but I feel that this story is too legendary. It's just like those night novels. Veronica turned around, her green eyes flashing with a wise smile. But everyone knows that stories are just stories. She stared at her blankly. I don't mean any harm. I'm just curious. I don't know. The girl lowered her head and shook it. Veronica seemed to be trying to discern the truth from Qianqi's expression, but she did not press on. It was as if this conversation was just a casual conversation. She only nodded. That little girl knew him before you. She did not know why, but she knew that Veronica was referring to Amandina. She nodded. What a mysterious little girl. Veronica licked her lips subconsciously. This habitual action was like 20 or 30 years ago when she met an opponent who she did not want to admit defeat on the battlefield. Her green eyes flashed with a wild light. She looked back. Are you still worried? She shook her head. She did not want to show her cowardice in front of outsiders. Veronica smiled. Let's wait for the wind and sand to die down a little. We'll go down and find him. The red-haired girl swung her ponytail and looked at her in surprise. Veronica did not say much. In fact, she rarely showed her friendly side in front of others, but this lonely girl touched a soft spot in her heart. It reminded her of when she was young. Veronica watched Qianqi's reaction carefully and felt a little amused. But it was at this time that a sudden sound came from the sandstorm outside. A piece of stone slid down the mountain wall in the wind, as if someone was walking between the cliffs. The sound of footsteps startled the two girls. Veronica subconsciously reached for the sword at her waist, but when she grabbed the air, she remembered that she had already given the azure skies to Brando. She only had time to raise her head and hear the footsteps outside getting closer and closer. Then a voice asked in the sandstorm outside, "Are there other travelers inside? Can you let me in to take shelter from the wind? This weather is really unfriendly." Veronica raised her eyebrows slightly when she heard the voice. "Please come in, Count." The lady hesitated for a moment before replying. Hearing this answer, the person outside the cave was slightly stunned. The other party seemed to be taken aback, but immediately rushed in. The light in the cave dimmed slightly. The person who came in pressed a hand on his sword and looked down at Veronica from the entrance of the cave. "Veronica!" A familiar face greeted Qianqi's eyes. Greysword Saint Mephistopheles. After entering the giant obsidian door that guarded Valhalla, it was as if they had entered a vast underground space. The entire space was immersed in endless, silent darkness. Brando and the others walked for a while in the absence of light, and their vision gradually adapted to the environment. They gradually found themselves walking up a cylindrical bridge, and there were many similar bridges around them. They were bunched up and formed a not steep slope. There were no handrails around these bridges, which sounded a little dangerous. But in fact, these cylindrical bridges were dozens of meters wide, and walking on them was still considered stable. It was just that when he looked back occasionally, the pillars behind him were inserted into the endless darkness below as if there was no end. When he raised his head, the top of the pillars also extended forward endlessly, drowning in the darkness. This visual illusion made them think that they were ascending vertically, as if they were walking between heaven and earth before the creation of chaos, and if they were not careful, they would lose their footing and fall into an endless abyss. Anyone who looked at such an environment would feel their limbs go weak, let alone a certain person in the group. Brando did not walk for long before he felt another hand holding his other than Sifrid's. He turned around and saw Faina, who was trembling in fear, standing beside him with a pale face. She looked at him pitifully, as if telling him not to make a sound. But Brando snickered inwardly. There was no way William did not notice her actions, and Sifrid's ears were also very sensitive. In other words, she was just deceiving herself. "Even the torch can't be lit?" Brando asked in the darkness. "The eternal torch is useless, and magic is also ineffective. Perhaps there is a magic suppression." The old wizard stood beside him as if he was talking about something unrelated to him, "But you can try a higher level spell. For example, an artificial sun." "Forget it." Brando was very clear about that spell, and he did not want to blow up this place. However, the darkness was not much of a threat to them, and he was more concerned about the enemy behind them. The young man turned around and looked at the place where he came from. Andesha and her helpers were circling around the place. It was the effect of William's spell. This great wizard indeed had the power to match his reputation, and no one dared to say that they could easily trap Andesha. The old wizard noticed Brando's expression and could not help but smile. He stroked the tip of his staff and said proudly, "This labyrinth spell should be able to trap them for a while, but I can't help you anymore, young man." It was Brendel's idea to set up an ambush behind Valhalla's gate. Even William did not know Andesha's personality, but Brendel was different. He knew that Andesha would definitely be at a disadvantage in this ambush. However, the plan was somewhat different from what he had originally envisioned. "If I remember correctly, the Tree Herders and the Silver Alliance are enemies, right?" Brando could not help but raise his head and ask, "Wouldn't it be better to take this opportunity to get rid of them?" He looked at the great wizard eagerly, hoping that he would make a move so that he could get rid of them once and for all. "You're dreaming." The old wizard laughed. "Actually, I'd like to, but the opponent is one of the 12 tree herders. Although I don't know how you managed to provoke such a person, the chances of winning against this woman are too low, so I won't make a move easily." Brando secretly glanced at the old wizard, thinking that this was really in line with the temperament of these craftsman wizards, quantifying the chances of winning a battle. It was no wonder that they had never really lost in any conflict. No matter what, the silver folk were monsters. However, he did not intend to persuade William so easily. He more or less retained some of the game's thinking, and at least in the Amber Sword, he would not blatantly give the players a chance to cheat. Even if it's a sneak attack. No. William shook his head. "All right, young man, don't think too much. This maze spell can trap Andesha for at least half an hour because she doesn't know that I'm here. If she sees me, this spell won't work. And even if this condition doesn't exist, she will discover that it's an illusion sooner or later. This is the first reason." The old wizard raised a finger. "The second reason is that I can't stay here with you for too long." "You're leaving?" Brendel was taken aback. The Archmage was currently his biggest backer, and he did not expect him to leave so soon after coming here. "The Green Tower is about to fall. You don't want your efforts to go to waste, do you?" William scratched his head that was full of silver hair. To be honest, Brendel found it hard to believe that a respected wizard leader would do such a nonsensical action. "All right," the old man said, "actually, this has nothing to do with me, but since Tolman asked for my help, I can't refuse. The Green Tower is about to fall so soon." Brando did not know that he had been unconscious for several days. He thought that there were no players participating in the Maze of Wolves. Fortunately, the leader of the Adepts of the Silver Union was here. This was a relief to him. If William took action, the calamity of wolves would not be able to threaten the Druids for the time being. But no matter what, he did not have much time left. The old wizard patted his shoulder and passed a box to him. "This is a gift from me, young man. There's a cloak in the box that will allow you to avoid Andesha's detection." "Wait," Brando shouted, "there are 3 of us, Grandmaster." "I know," the old wizard smiled, "that's why this cloak is used by the giants." "Used by the giants?" Brando had a strange expression on his face. What kind of strange setting was this? "That's right, but it has a flaw. It can only be used once a day. After that, it's no different from a normal cloak." "Do all Magi's items have such strange temperaments?" Brando took the box and asked in annoyance. Everything that was happening right now reminded him of his experience in the game. He did not have a good impression of Magi's creations. "Oh, it seems like you're quite familiar with them." "I'm relieved." The old wizard smiled and waved his staff in the air, opening a silver door of light. "But don't underestimate this cloak. When it's in effect, even the Dragon King will not be able to break through its concealment." "Dragon King? You mean Bahamut?" Brando was stunned. He could not help but look at the box in disbelief. But whether it was the Fire Dragon King Bahamut or the War Dragon Tiamat, if this cloak was as the old wizard had said, then it was at least a mythical item. But was a mythical item like this? Brando turned around and saw the old wizard walk into the door of light. But in the end, William suddenly turned around and said to him in a serious tone, "Young man, I'll leave you with the time. The rest is up to you. Wait, I'll say." Brando suddenly reacted, "You haven't told me what the activation incantation is." It was a pity that William didn't hear his last sentence. The door of light flashed in the darkness and then disappeared as if it had never existed. What the heck? At that moment Brendel felt like he was being cheated. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to vote for it at Cheat.com. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 447. The silver door disappeared without a trace, as if it had never existed. Brendel held the box in his hand and was at a loss for what to do. Pfft, Vahina giggled as she looked at the young man. "Is it that funny?" Brando asked in annoyance as he opened the box. "TSK. What can you do if I want to laugh?" "Yeah, I don't even know whose claw this is." Brando shook his head and sighed as he looked at his left hand. The Princess of Flower and Leaf Collar flung her hand away at lightning speed. Her pink neck was dyed with a layer of red. How could you say that, eh? Did I promise you anything?" Vahina clenched her fists as she glared at Brando. Her eyes were spitting fire as if she wanted to eat him alive. Vahina stomped her foot and scolded, "Just you wait, I'll complain to Lady Veronica." "Complain? Say what?" Vahina was stunned. She blushed and stuttered, I'll say that you took advantage of me." This woman, Brando stared at Vahina with his mouth agape. He never thought that she would do something like that. It felt like he was punched in the face, and it took him a while to recover. "You're really going to say that?" "Of course not. I'm lying." Vahina snorted softly, "It's not like I'll get anything out of it. Besides, it's embarrassing to be taken advantage of by a country bumpkin." Brando was speechless. But if this brainless woman with no breasts really went to the Duke of Flowerleaf and said something she shouldn't say, he was afraid that the Duke would send the Kurlutz Empire's Pegasus Knights to arrest him and bring him to justice. But he almost forgot about the box in his hand due to the argument between the two. Speaking of the box in his hand, Brando quickly realized that the box in his hand seemed to be a magic item. He pulled out a long cloak from the box like a curtain, and the corners of the cloak kept coming out of the box. In the end, the cloak was several times bigger than the box in his hand. But no matter how magical this cloak was, if there was no activation spell, it was really no different from a curtain. It was even worse than a curtain, because at least the curtain had beautiful patterns on it that could block the sun. Brando shook the cloak. He could only treat it as a large piece of cloth. It would be a pity to throw it away, but he also felt that it was too heavy. He realized that William had given him a difficult problem. After some consideration, he wrapped the cloak around his hand and continued to walk forward. This underground passage shouldn't be too long. He remembered that the player had mentioned in his post that the player had walked in the dark for more than 10 minutes. Just as he was about to give up and return to the city, he suddenly entered the center of the loop of trade winds. In that case, it should be the same here. He raised his head and looked up. The vase-like bridge seemed to converge at a certain point above. The higher he went, the more obvious he could feel this. Brando silently calculated the time. He was holding Sifrid's hand, and Faina was right behind him. Their footsteps were exceptionally clear in the darkness and silence. The rustling of the footsteps did not sound like footsteps on the ground, but rather like some kind of sneaky shadow following behind them. It was a chilling sight to behold. Faina turned her head several times to look behind her, but it was pitch black. She wanted to follow Brando closely, but when she thought of Brando's repulsive appearance, she could not help but fall back a few steps to avoid being ridiculed. After about half an hour, Brando felt the air around him begin to move. This made him feel that the player's strategy was a little too deceitful. But when he thought about it again, it was not easy to keep track of time in the dark. It was inevitable that there would be mistakes, so he felt at ease. After a few more minutes, another stone door appeared in front of him. This door opened upwards at a slanted angle from the ground. The mysterious and historical patterns on the door were immersed in the darkness, like a piece of history buried deep under the dust. But this door was much smaller than the one below. It was only a tenth the size of the one below. Brendel thought that he would need to open the door again, but when they got close to it, the door creaked on its own, and the dust that was constantly falling off the door sank in. Instead of saying that the door sank in, it was more like the door was opening bit by bit. Brendel could not help but be slightly surprised. He did not expect the door to have its own senses, and thought that it was quite advanced. But when the door opened, the scenery behind it left him speechless. Even Fiona and Sifrid behind him could not help but widen their eyes in shock. At first, a ray of light poured out from behind the door. This was the first time they had come into contact with sunlight after entering the Evernight world. The gentle white light poured in like water from the door, seeping in through every opening and turning into spots of light that fell on their faces. Then, the gap between the door grew bigger and bigger, and more light appeared. The beams of light were like sharp swords that cut through the darkness. The sharp swords pierced through the darkness and caused it to fall apart. The white light engulfed the three of them like a tide. Brando, Fiona, and Sifrid could not help but squint their eyes. However, when their eyes adjusted to the bright environment again, the scenery behind them suddenly captured everyone's hearts. The loop of trade winds was located at the center of the Kalanga Mountains, the center of the storm. Brendel had imagined the peaceful area in the eye of the storm more than once. But just as he imagined, this place was a basin surrounded by mountains. The undulating peaks were the same as the ones he saw at the Wolf's Pass and the Wall of Roses. The only difference was that the scenery here was much more beautiful. Looking from afar, the distant view was the circulation of the atmosphere surrounding the mountains. The surrounding storm formed a wall hundreds of meters high above the mountains. For hundreds of years, no one had passed through the invisible wall of atmosphere to enter this place. Brando could only confirm that they had entered the heart of the loop of trade winds when he saw the raging winds in the sky. He raised his head and saw a thick layer of clouds in the middle of the sky. Golden light shone from the edges of the clouds, and the sun shone down on the vast land. It was as if the darkness and storm outside the loop of trade winds, as well as the berserk mana tide, didn't exist. It was peaceful here. Flocks of birds could be seen in the distance, as if it was a scene from a mythological tale. But Brando's attention was immediately attracted by another thing. It was a giant tree in the middle of the basin. In fact, he was not even sure if it was a tree. He had to look up to see the full picture of the giant tree. The crown of the tree almost covered half the sky. The huge trunk pierced through the clouds, and the huge roots under the trunk occupied almost the entire basin. Its roots were deeply rooted in the ground, and it was covered with layers of moss. From afar, it looked like a green mountain range. Brendel sucked in a cold breath. This was the World Tree. Legend has it that in ancient times, the Druids also owned a golden oak tree that was as large as heaven and earth. At that time, the Ring of the Sky was still called the Ring of the World. They lived around this tree for generations. But after the collapse of Babel Tower, the World Tree was also destroyed in the war. The Druids split up, and today's Loop of the Sky and Tree Herders were formed. However, there was no record of another world tree in this world. Brendel's jaw dropped as he stared at the giant tree. It was not as glorious as described in the legends, but more like nature. Green moss and forests covered the roots and trunk of the giant tree with a layer of verdant green. It was a vibrant green. Clouds curled around the trunk of the giant tree, and there were flashes of lightning flashing through them. This can't be the world tree in Norse mythology, right? Brando muttered to himself. Is this the world tree in the legends, Brother Brando? Sifrid asked with a light sigh. Brando nodded. He suddenly thought of the cylindrical bridges that they crossed. Perhaps they were not bridges at all, but the roots of the world tree that were inserted into the ground. The thinnest roots were at least 100 meters in diameter. Oh, Martha! Brendel took a deep breath and narrowed his eyes as he looked at the emerald green forest. Large flocks of birds flew above the canopy, but the entire forest was silent, and there was not a single trace of human activity. This is Valhalla. Brando suddenly understood what was going on. In the game, Valhalla was destroyed in a fire. Although it was a little ridiculous to say that the world tree would be destroyed in a fire, it made sense that such a forest would fall into a sea of fire. Brando. The stuttering voice belonged to Vahina. The noble lady was so shocked that she almost bit her tongue. She even secretly pulled at her cheeks to confirm that she was not dreaming. What is it now? Brando turned around. Look at that tree. Vahina raised her hand and pointed at it. Brando looked up and was slightly startled. He was so shocked that he did not notice that the world tree's canopy above the clouds had no leaves. A withered world tree. He could not help but exclaim. No, not that. Vahina replied, there's something below. What else is there? Brando looked down, but he could not move his gaze away. It was as if his eyes were rooted to the center of the world tree. There was a circle of man-made buildings around the trunk of the world tree. Or rather, it was an extremely huge palace. It was surrounded by clouds and lightning, as if it was the residence of the ancient gods. Even from such a distance, one could feel the majesty and magnificence of this building. Valhalla. Brando blurted out. What is that? Vahina did not understand. But just as she was about to ask her question, Brendel suddenly heard another exclamation from the forest not far away, chaos above, the world tree. It was Endesha's hoarse voice. Both of their expressions changed. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 448. Brando immediately turned around and placed his index finger on his lips, gesturing for Faina and Sifrit to keep quiet. Andesha's voice caused Faina's face to turn pale. She almost screamed out loud, but when she saw Brando's action, she covered her mouth and calmed herself down. The forest became quiet once more. Not far away, there was a certain Pteroptera making a monotonous noise in the bushes. A few small rodents were also making rustling noises as they darted through the weeds. Faina could almost hear her own pulse beating vigorously in this strange silence. Her blood was pumping faster due to her nervousness, but her fingers and face were turning paler. What should we do? She mouthed the question. Her arrogance seemed to have disappeared without a trace, leaving behind an ordinary girl who looked at Brando with fear in her eyes. She realized that he was the only person she could rely on right now. Brando glanced at her. At this moment, the noble lady's face was as dirty as a cat's, and her beautiful blonde ponytail was also covered in dust. Although anyone would be like this after the previous battle, he still felt that she was much cuter than before. At the very least, the arrogant and domineering attitude she had when she bickered with him was long gone. Don't worry. Brendel mouthed the same reply. Brando knew that her current attitude was only temporary. She was still the daughter of the Duke of Cruz, and her arrogance was engraved in her bones. She was still bickering with him before Endesha appeared. He calmed himself down and listened carefully. There were faint footsteps coming from the other side of the forest. Endesha did not seem to have any intention of hiding herself, and there was no need for her to do so with her strength. She would only hide herself out of fear, and a true expert would not do so. Just like how they were doing right now. Back in the game, I didn't have many opportunities to use stealth as a level 130 warrior. The time I learned the skills of a rogue was a memory from many years ago. That experience was exciting, but it was different now. Running for his life in the real world meant that his life was in constant danger, and the feeling of having a knife at his back was not exciting at all. Instead, he felt nervous and scared to death. Brando was not used to such a difference, but because of his past experience, he was able to calm down quickly. He stood motionless and heard 2 footsteps, one after the other, hesitating not far to the west. That direction was quite close, which meant that there might be more than one exit to the surface. However, could this be considered a form of luck? Then he heard Andesha's voice. That brat might have already left. I didn't think that there would be people from the Silver Alliance protecting them in secret apart from the druids. That spell from before had a familiar aura. I wonder if it was one of those old guys. Hearing this voice, Brando couldn't help but hold his breath subconsciously. But immediately, another man's voice sounded familiar. I didn't expect a monster like you to regret making so many enemies. Isn't this a form of mockery? Making too many enemies. What a joke! Andesha's voice was slightly shrill, and Brendel could hear that she was sneering. I can understand why you cowards are afraid of the slightest thing. But if that's the case, why don't you cowards just go back to your filthy nest? All right, the man's voice softened. I'm not here to quarrel with you, Andesha. Compared to that, I'm more curious about the existence of another world. I don't doubt that we are the first batch of visitors to this place after thousands of years. It's the second batch. Don't forget, they might have already entered. Brando knew that they Andesha was referring to was him. She probably didn't dare to confirm how many people were with him, and if she had doubts, she would have scruples. This was good news for him. It doesn't matter, Andesha. Did you notice that the young man knew about this place from the start? I don't believe that he would open that door without any preparation. The man continued, even though the door outside is the legacy of the foolish humans, you have to admit that in the Golden Era, these things are magnificent compared to the pitiful civilizations of the present. Do you think, Andesha, that such an existence would open the door without any warning? What are you trying to say, Mihala? Oh, I forgot that you should be called. Andesha retorted with a frivolous tone, but the man interrupted her before she could finish. Andesha, don't you care about what the druids are secretly preparing behind everyone's backs? Not to mention that those old fogies from the Silver Alliance are also involved. There are fragments of the ceiling stone here, and there might be something even more shocking. Something even more shocking. Isn't this world tree enough? This withered world tree is probably an experimental product of the ancient war, but it's nothing. You know that very well, Andesha. Perhaps, but I also want to know. That's why you should stop talking nonsense and come with me. Your personality hasn't changed at all. The man replied. The two of them stopped talking, and Brando immediately held his breath. He knew that Andesha's perception was frighteningly high, and it meant that they would be discovered if they were the slightest bit careless. Andesha didn't even need to focus her attention to do so. Faina also understood this point. Even though she was a little arrogant, she was still quite knowledgeable. As someone from the upper class of the Cruz Empire, she had seen all kinds of experts and knew how terrifying Andesha was. The last one was Sifrit. She was a cautious and quick-witted girl from the mountains. She only needed to see her brother Brando's choice to know what to do. She raised her head, her large green eyes darting around, but she didn't make a single sound. The three of them stood there like puppets, and they heard footsteps from the other side of the bushes. It seemed like Andesha and the man called Mihara were looking for directions. They might have entered the center of the forest, Andesha said, and the footsteps gradually moved away from the world tree. After a long time, Brando finally let out a sigh of relief. Phew, Faina let out a long sigh and patted her chest with a pale face. She looked like she had just been fished out of the water. Her back was drenched in sweat, and her forehead was also covered in cold sweat. Great, they're far away. Let's use this chance to turn back. She immediately said. Turn back. Of course. That woman thinks that we've entered the forest. Before she can react, we should meet up with Lady Veronica and leave this place as soon as possible, right? Faina's eyes widened as she spoke. No, you're mistaken about one thing. Brando shook his head solemnly. You should be the one to turn back, my lady. That's fine too. Ekis is still sleeping outside and won't be waking up anytime soon. Andesha has also defeated the nightmare, so there shouldn't be any danger on the way back. You should remember the way back, right? Faina was stunned, and her eyebrows rose sharply. Why you want me to go back alone? What else do you want? Why you're not going to accompany me? Faina asked in disbelief. Brando was a little confused. Just how natural was it for her to ask him to accompany her back? Could it be that they were familiar with each other? Why should I accompany you? He naturally rejected her request. You. Faina's face turned green and white as she looked at him. She was about to throw a tantrum, but for some reason, she calmed down halfway. Then why are you staying here? There's such a big tree there. Anyone would be curious about it, my lady. Brando naturally wouldn't tell her the truth and simply pointed at the world tree. Of course, anyone with a normal mind could hear the perfunctory tone in his words. Hey, curiosity isn't as important as your life, eh? Brando was surprised and asked curiously, are you worried about me, or are you worried that no one will accompany you back? Faina's face flushed red. She raised her eyebrows and shouted, none of them, you idiot. I'm just asking, I don't care about your life. Then I'm leaving. Don't blame me if you die. After saying that, she took a deep breath and turned to leave. Brando looked at her back and shrugged. He was more serious than her. Even though it was a little out of his expectations, he had no choice but to stay and fight with Andesha for the right to rule Valhalla. It sounded inconceivable, but it wasn't unrealistic. Andesha did not know the true meaning of this place and did not have a clear goal like him. Brando had already taken the initiative. Secondly, he was together with Sifrid, and Valhalla had already acknowledged him as its sovereign. If he could obtain control of this legendary territory, he could use the power of this place to defeat Andesha. It was like a god having a huge advantage in his own divine kingdom. Even though it was a little exaggerated to say that. But according to Brando's knowledge, it was enough for Valhalla's sleeping guards to chase Andesha away. Even though it was unrealistic to keep Andesha in this place. However, while these possibilities sounded simple in theory, they were actually extremely dangerous in practice. Especially to seize the initiative under Andesha's nose. Just the thought of it was as difficult as ascending to the heavens. Brando was not interested in bringing a burden along with him when he made such a desperate gamble. He was more than willing to find an opportunity to send Faina away. In fact, he was more willing to send Sifrid to a safe place. Only a lone ranger would be able to walk safely on the edge of danger. But what Brando did not expect was that just as Faina's figure disappeared behind the door and he heaved a sigh of relief, Faina walked out from the door again. Hey, she was obviously scared to death in the dark, and her face was unbelievably pale, but the first thing she said was, right, I suddenly remembered that the people of Kurlutz don't have the habit of abandoning their companions. Although we were enemies before, after all, you saved me once. You may be heartless, but I can't be unrighteous. Brando's face darkened. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Cheat.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 449. The forest was very quiet. Brando pushed aside the overgrown vines and barely heard any sound as he moved through the forest. Even the birds rarely flew over their heads. Looking ahead from where he was now, behind the layers of leaves was an open basin in the distance. The dense forest was like a dazzling jasper lying in the middle of the mountains. The terrain gradually lowered towards the center, forming a depression. Looking further, there was a magnificent tree in the center of the basin. The tree's roots spread out in all directions, forming a mountain range. The nearest root extended less than a mile in this direction. Andesha and her companions should have already arrived there. He did not dare to get too close. After all, the Lord of Withering was a half-druid, and had many advantages in any forest. He led the two women along a small path. Traces of the path's existence could be vaguely seen in the grass, although it had long been lost in the passage of time. However, the artificially carved slate fragments scattered in the dense forest silently told the story of the past. Brando looked up. Now, only the dense aerial roots hanging down from the towering trees and the dense bushes under his feet were left. The gray-green plants clung to the waxy white rocks on both sides of the path. Only occasionally, through the gaps between the roots, could he see traces of what looked like words on the flat surface of the rocks. However, they had long eroded away. If Brando's guess was correct, those words should belong to the Silver Folk. Of course, it was not the ancient Elven language or the wizard language. The people who lived in Valhalla in ancient times should have long been lost in the long river of time. There was not a single word that mentioned who they were. However, Brando guessed that the Silver Folk might have an inseparable relationship with the children of the forest. Today, Eruin's entire southern territory had their legacy. But for some reason, even the Silver Elves did not have any description of Valhalla's past. In fact, the Silver Elves and Valhalla seemed to have the same origin. Brando had asked the Silver Elf princess, but the answer he received was not beyond what he knew. Metasha once said that Valhalla should be much older than the Silver Elves. The Silver Elves, Mist Elves, and Moon Elves, the three silver bloodlines, and their common elven court, Alfheim, appeared in the era dominated by the Dark Dragon after the World Tree split. Valhalla was already a legend even before the Dusk War. In the current Wound, the Twilight Dragon had long been an illusory symbol. Most ordinary people knew about this great demon, but they also knew that it was already dead. The story that happened in the myth, only the monks and players of the Holy Cathedral knew a little about the forces of chaos. But in comparison, they only had to deal with the cultists who acted in the name of Dusk. Not to mention the war of heaven and earth and the Sacred Covenant, even the war of the Holy Saints with the darkness was a distant history. Not to mention the legends that existed in the same era as the Twilight Dragon, such as Valhalla, the Azure Knight, and the Blue Epic, which had long become ballads and stories of bards. If I'm not mistaken, those are words, right? Vahina asked softly behind him. Ever since this noble daughter did not dare to go back alone, she simply relied on Brando. She could see that although Brando was not like the other noble youths who were subservient to her and did not always get along with her, at least he would not really do anything to her. Can't you see for yourself? Brando replied in annoyance. But I remember that the last time the people of Eruin opened up the wilderness was 53 years ago. It was Baron Rumman from the House of Viro, and he was also the last pioneer knight of Eruin. The book said that before that, the land south of Ranner was a true dark forest, a land without a master, and no civilization had ever owned this place. But if these are really words and prove that there was a civilization here, then the Loop of Trade Winds is a land that once declined, and not a natural dark forest. Then wouldn't the book be wrong? Dee, don't look at me like that. I was excellent in my Imperial Chronicles subject, and I was even praised by Master von Hain. Vahina replied uncomfortably under Brando's gaze. Is it the dwarf master who claimed to be able to decipher the blue epic? Brando asked. Only part of it. Although Master von Hain is a dwarf, he is a naturalized citizen of the Empire. Vahina raised her chin proudly, unconsciously showing off her identity tag. But doesn't he know that the Druids lived in the Dark Forest 500 years before the people of Erewhon? What does he mean by the land south of Randner is a land without a master? Brando mocked. Hey! That doesn't count, the Druids have no need for land. Yes, does Cruz dare to use this as an excuse to expel all the Druids from their borders? Then wouldn't the Empire's territory expand by another circle? Congratulations. Compared to this, what really caused Brando's dissatisfaction was the fact that Vahina's Imperial Chronicles included Erewhon's history. This was also the reason why this noble lady knew so much about Erewhon's past. The people of the Empire had never seen Erewhon as an independent country. In fact, he was very clear that in the eyes of the Cruz Empire, especially the nobles who supported the Empire's politics, Erewhon was more like an overseas territory of the Empire. It was this kind of arrogance that every player in Erewhon could not tolerate. Of course, Brando would not go so far as to make things difficult for a little girl who did not know anything. He was just stepping on the little tail of the noble lady that had just been raised, lest she get carried away. Then, the young lord turned around and looked at the lush green forest. This path in the forest did not exist alone. The path had always been used to connect the other parts of the city that originally existed in the forest. Although Brando did not know where this path led to, it did not take long for them to realize this point. After parting the heavy shrubs, the road led to an abandoned ruin in the woodland. The first thing that caught their eyes were the tall buildings piled up with rocks. These buildings were surrounded by a quiet green, quietly standing in the open space here. But just as Brando's head popped out from the shrubs, he felt Sifrid tugging at his hand. He immediately retracted his hand and asked in a low voice, "What's wrong?" "There's a bad guy." The little girl looked at him and mouthed, "Over there." Sifrid pointed outside. Brando's gaze followed her finger and saw that she was pointing at the tallest building in the ruins. Brando looked carefully and immediately noticed something strange. There was a plant on the roof of the building that seemed a little strange. Brando suddenly sucked in a breath of cold air. He discovered that it was not a plant, but Endesha. She was extremely good at concealing herself, and with her half-druid innate ability, it was difficult for ordinary people to detect her presence. But it was a pity that her opponent was the daughter of the forest, Sifrid, who was favored by the goddess of Naya. Even so, Brando was still frightened to the point where he broke out in cold sweat. He realized that it was a wise choice not to send Sifrid back. There were too many benefits to fighting in the forest with the help of the goddess of the forest's daughter. Sho! Brando immediately gestured to Faina, who was following behind him. He then looked outside. This should be a market. Brando recognized it from the circular layout. The tallest building was undoubtedly the temple of the god of trade. In the past, when the gods still existed, this temple must have been quite prosperous. And right now, Endesha was standing on the roof of the temple. As a qualified cultist, she did not have a good impression of any gods, nor did she have the most basic respect for them. Even though the gods of Wonde had always protected the humans before the War of the Holy Saints, she was still a god of trade. Faina also saw Endesha and was shocked. Why is she here? She quickly looked at Brando and mouthed the question. If you have any intelligence, you would know that she's looking for us. Brendel gestured as he replied. She took a deep breath and complained, "It's all your fault. That's why I said we should turn back. I didn't stop you from leaving." Brendel glared at her, thinking to himself, I didn't stop you from leaving. However, He couldn't be bothered to pay attention to this young lady whose temper had flared up again. He simply mouthed his reply, "I'm sorry, I can't understand such complicated signs." Faina was dumbfounded. If Andesha continued to stay in front of him, he would not be able to find a chance to reach the core of Valhalla first. Since she had stopped, he would not be able to find a way to reach the core of Valhalla. Since she stopped, this was his chance to seize the initiative. Brando raised his head and looked around. He did not see the woman's companions, but he guessed that they should be in the market as well. He looked into the distance and noticed the exit on the other side of the market. He suddenly realized why Andesha chose to stop here. It was because there was a tall wall there. The wall was made of the same material as the buildings here, and it was covered with vines and roots. Most of it was buried in the canopy of the trees, and it was impossible to notice it from a distance. But Brando could not help but take a deep breath when he looked at the wall. If he did not guess wrongly, the wall should be around the World Tree. The two ends of the wall were connected to the World Tree's two mountain-like roots, forming a natural arc of protection. There were several inner walls behind the wall, and there should be a fan-shaped city inside. The idea of using the World Tree's roots to build a fortress was extremely ingenious. If Brando was in his position, he would be extremely satisfied, but he could only feel a bitter taste in his mouth. The only exit was at the other end of the market. If he was not mistaken, Andesha should be monitoring that direction. Although she did not know what this place was for, she was definitely not as simpleton as one of the 12 patriarchs of the Tree Shepherds. At least her judgment was the most accurate. If not for Sifrid, he would have been discovered by her. But there were no ifs in history. Brando had discovered Andesha first, and he had a slight hope of defeating her. But how do I get through the market? Brando felt a headache coming on. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 450. Faina suddenly tugged at his sleeve, and Brando turned around. You want to go there? She mouthed the question and pointed at the street in the center of the ruins that was covered with intertwined vines. Brando nodded. You're crazy. Faina looked at him in disbelief. Wait, are you going to use that cloak? If that cloak works, then I'll use it. Brando thought to himself. But a certain Alzheimer's patient didn't even give me the incantation to activate it. Who knows how to use it? He shook his head. Faina looked at him in confusion, but the youth had already gestured for her to stay. Then he crouched down and crawled out of the ruins. His actions caused Faina to jump in fright. She watched as he crawled to a spot less than 10 feet away from the ruins and stopped. She was so frightened that she opened her mouth but did not dare to make a single sound. But Brando did not lose his mind. He knew the consequences of sneaking out like this. Even though he had some experience in stealth, he knew that he was far from being able to match up to the truly powerful nightingales and rangers. Even if they were 10 levels lower than Andesha, they could not guarantee that they would not be discovered by a monster like Andesha. This was especially so in the forest, and there was no need to talk about him. Brando knew his own limits, and he was just observing from afar. In the forest, he could not come to a conclusion just by looking at it from afar. He did not have the habit of wasting time, so he could only choose to take the risk. He hesitated as he laid prone on the ground. His gaze passed through the shrubs and landed on the ruins not far away. His mind spun rapidly as he tried to think of a way to safely pass through the ruins. But that's a bit of a fantasy. Andesha isn't an idiot. Since she's here, it means that she has 100% chance of finding me. Brando stared at the ruins without a clue, and a few unrelated thoughts floated into his mind. If this is a game, then there should be a way to complete the quest, right? Brendel suddenly felt a flash of inspiration in his mind. He recalled some things that happened in the game in the past. He vaguely remembered that when the Amber Sword was first released for testing, this game caused a sensation because it was very different from traditional games. This was because most games were designed to test the players. However, no matter how difficult a mission was, it still had to leave a way for the players to complete it. In a simple game, the path was smooth. In a difficult game, the path was full of thorns. But a path full of thorns was still a path at the very least. The Amber Sword, on the other hand, used a completely different design philosophy. The game pursued the greatest degree of realism. There was a famous quote from the game's designer: "There is no path in the forest, you have to rely on your courage and wisdom to open it." Therefore, the Amber Sword didn't have a quest that was impossible to complete. Just like the joke in the Emerald Summit, the design team actually designed a drop list for the Emerald Dragon, but they could have omitted it. Because the Emerald Dragon has always been known as the world's leader that can never be killed. Note, because it has the only highest level of eternity in the entire world of Wound, the Emerald Dragon is defined as existing in countless parallel universes at the same time. Therefore, it can't be killed at any place at any time. This is almost equivalent to being immortal. Therefore, it is called the Immortal in the Amber Sword, which is a boss that can't be killed. Therefore, the drop list that the players jokingly call meaningless, because it will never be used. But this was the concept of the Amber Sword. The designer gave it the possibility of being real. Although the players initially called this reality as making things difficult, they eventually accepted this design concept. If the Amber Sword wasn't the only VR game in the world at that time, it would have been abandoned by the players a long time ago. What the players pursued was gameplay and not logic. Brendel could not help but think absent-mindedly. Because of this, he suddenly vaguely felt that he had grasped the idea. If the game's original intention was to provide a possibility of being real, it may seem to be making things difficult for the players, but in fact, it was abandoning the one or only few paths of the past games. If there was no such thing as a strategy, then create your own strategy. This was the so-called spirit of the Amber Sword. Brando took a deep breath. He finally thought of a way. If he couldn't complete the quest perfectly, then abandoning the pawn to save the cart was not necessarily a bad choice. He looked to the side, then calmed down and carefully retraced his steps. But as soon as he stepped out of the bushes, the first thing he saw was Vahina looking at him with a pale face, as if he had done something unforgivable. "My life will be shortened by at least 10 years if I'm with you." She glared at him and said. "If that's the case, I'm afraid I'll die prematurely later." Brendel glanced at her and replied. What do you mean? Do you see that ruin over there? We'll use it as a cover to sneak past it. I've looked carefully just now, that's the most likely path, the others are basically dead ends. Brando explained his thoughts clearly, but Vahina looked at the direction he was pointing at and opened her mouth. That looks good, but Country Bumpkin, didn't you notice that there's no cover at the end? We'll definitely be discovered no matter what, right? She couldn't help but raise her eyebrows and refute. I say, that woman is one of the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders, don't treat her like an idiot. Her appearance here means that she's confident in catching us. Of course I know, I've noticed it too. Brando shook his head, but I know that she's not going to treat us as idiots after her previous experience. Since that's the case, she won't pay too much attention to that direction. I understand the logic of doing the opposite, Vahina frowned, but what's the use of sneaking past the first half? The second half is a flat field, she'll discover us even if she's not paying attention. Brando did not reply. He knew that there was no such thing as perfection. But he had to think of a way to solve half of the problem first, and the rest would be up to him. It was impossible for him to not take any risks at this point in time, and he didn't have much time to waste. Even with William's help, it was still a question of how long the druids outside could last. So he shook his head. "Hey!" Vahina was so anxious that she almost shouted. She grabbed Sifrid, who was beside her. "Sifrid, you have to persuade your big brother. This lunatic wants to commit suicide, I don't want to accompany him." Sifrid looked at the two of them and shook her head. She had no intention of objecting. Brando's decision was her decision. Vahina was speechless. "You can stay behind," Brando said. He had no reason to bring her along, especially when it looked like they were going to their deaths. But the Princess of Flowerleaf hesitated. She didn't know why, but she felt a little flustered. She should have agreed, but she looked at Brando and Sifrid and lost her temper for no reason. "No, you have to bring me along." Vahina raised her eyebrows in anger. Brendel could not understand the young lady's train of thought for a moment, and could not help but say in annoyance, "I say, don't you think you're a burden? Who told you to leave me behind at Lady Veronica's place? You're the one who brought me here, so you have to take responsibility. Are you still a noble if you want to leave me behind? I'm not a noble to begin with." Brando almost shouted out. But he looked at Vahina's serious expression, as if she was going to follow him if he didn't agree. He looked at Sifrid again and finally compromised. "It's the same as bringing one or two, isn't it?" Brando could not help but think that Vahina was the one who wanted to die, so she couldn't blame him if anything happened. Therefore, he sighed and reluctantly agreed with Vahina. Vahina glared at him and heaved a sigh of relief. It was as if she had finally gained the upper hand in this long struggle. "Are we leaving now?" she asked. Brando wanted to say aye, but he could only nod in agreement. Moreover, it was indeed time for him to start moving after persuading Vahina. If he was alone, it would be a piece of cake for him to pass through the ruins. Of course, the plaza behind him would still be a big problem. But now that he had Vahina and Sifrid with him, the problem became much more complicated. He did not dare to let Vahina and Sifrid follow him, so he had to carry them back twice. It was a little comical, but the truth was that even if he was carrying a person, his stealth skills were much better than Vahina's when she was alone. The first time he carried Sifrid through the ruins was very smooth. He carefully left the forest from the side where the vegetation was dense, then used a broken wall as cover to sneak into the stone house. Just as he had predicted, this direction was facing away from Endesha. She did not pay too much attention to this place because she knew that Brando would be discovered no matter how skilled he was. After settling Sifrid down, he turned around and went back to fetch Vahina. His movements were swift, and he barely made a sound when he passed through the bushes. Vahina from Cruz was stunned by his brilliant technique. She was quite knowledgeable, and knew very well that only the best scouts in the army could do such details. Most nobles would not learn such things, except for those with special identities. For example, the royal family spies. Vahina had interacted with her father's spies before, but their skills were nothing compared to Brando's. What she did not know was that Brando did not care about his stealth skills at all. She could not imagine how terrifying the stealth skills of the professional nightingales and rangers in the game were. When one's stealth skill reached level 10 and above, one could even deceive one's eyes. In other words, one could not even notice a person standing right in front of them. Once one reached level 15, they would be able to grasp the legendary visual concealment skill. Disappearing in front of people was an effect that could only be achieved by magic. Magic could dispel it, but stealth could not. The stealth skill of a high-level nightingale was naturally not that simple. Vahina finally regained her senses when Brendel picked her up. She was so frightened that she almost screamed out loud, but he quickly covered her mouth with his hand to stop her from screaming. Brendel glared at her fiercely, reminding her to be aware of the situation. Vahina's face reddened. Even though this was not the first time he carried her like this, the last time was when they jumped down from a bottomless cliff. She was too frightened to think too much about it. The second time was also when she was trying to dodge the Lernea's attack. She was still conscious this time, but she preferred not to be that conscious. At the very least, she would not feel so embarrassed that her face felt like it was burning. When she finally regained her senses, Brando had already placed her behind a wall. After several trips, Brando finally brought Sifrit and Vahina to the last part of the ruins. The plaza was right in front of them, and the rest was just like what he had said before. It was time to risk it all. He patted the noble lady awake and mouthed, "Are you really not going to stay? You might lose your life if you stay here." Brando tried to scare her away one last time, but the answer he got was still negative. He did not know what was wrong with her, but she shook her head and stared at him with determination. It was as though Cruz had never abandoned his comrades, and Brando felt that something was amiss. "Forget it," he sighed, "I've done my best." He then poked his head out to see how they could cross the plaza. However, his expression changed at once. In fact, he wasn't the only one. Vahina, who was with him, almost cried out in surprise. He saw a figure in red robes standing on the other side of the plaza. "Damn it, I knew it." Brando cursed in his mind. He thought that Andesha would at least make a mistake, even if it was not a mistake in the first place. But he did not expect Andesha to be so meticulous. Her companion was guarding the other side of the plaza, and they did not even have the slightest chance. Brando retreated and gritted his teeth, but he could not think of a solution. But Vahina grabbed his hand. "This distance is already very short, why don't you try using the cloak? It should last long enough." Cloak. Brando was stunned for a moment. He then remembered that Vahina was talking about the cloak that William gave him. He felt a little gloomy and thought that he would have used it long ago. If the cloak could hide from the Dragon King's senses like William said, then it would be a piece of cake for him to hide from Andesha. But there were no ifs. He could not help but shake off Vahina's hand. He suspected that she had lost her mind because of fear. She should have known the reason back then, or was it because William's Alzheimer's disease was contagious? But Vahina grabbed his hand again and asked, "Hey, do you really think that thing can't be activated? Have you forgotten what I do?" Brando was stunned. "What do you do?" "A noble lady." "Go to hell." Vahina gritted her teeth and glared at him. "Bumpkin, I'm a magic swordsman, and analyzing incantations is my specialty." "Ha!" Brando was stunned. "You can do it. That thing is at least a mythical item, and the magic circles on it are very different from what we have now. If I remember correctly, you don't even have an official rank, right?" "That's because I'm a noble." Her Royal Highness of the Flower Leaf Estate looked annoyed. "It's impossible for me to participate in the job evaluation of the Adventurers Guild. Besides, as a noble, I've learned much more than the average person." Brando was stunned for a moment, but he suddenly felt that there was a possibility. He stopped and asked with a serious tone for the first time, "Is it really possible?" "I don't know, but I have to try." Vahina did not dare to speak too confidently, but she was much more serious when it came to her profession, and did not put on airs like before. Brendel nodded and handed over the cloak that was wrapped around his hand. Vahina took the cloak and felt it with her hand. It was a purely physical task, for the cloak was, as William had said, astonishingly large. But after a few minutes, Vahina suddenly cried out in surprise. Even though her voice was soft, it almost made Brando jump in fright. He immediately turned around to look at the ruins, but fortunately, Andesha did not notice it. He immediately turned around and glared at Vahina. If not for the fact that he was certain that it was impossible, he would have suspected that she was a spy. This time, Vahina seemed to have realized her mistake and showed an embarrassed expression for the first time. She stuck her tongue out at him, but she still happily mouthed to Brando, "Bumpkin, I've learned the magic circles for this thing before." "You've learned it before?" Brando's surprise immediately turned into joy. He did not expect such a coincidence even in his dreams. If Vahina had learned it before, then it would not be difficult to find the activation incantation. With Martha above, he immediately felt that luck had not left him. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Cheetian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.